Ryan had barely slid the wedding band onto my finger when my 12-year-old daughter, Claire, crumpled beside the altar before I had made my final declaration, and before the officiant could pronounce us married. She didn't move. I dropped to the floor, but Ryan stepped around us to grab my best friend's son and inspect a thin cut on his arm. "My daughter should have been more careful," he said. I called 911, pulled off the ring he had just placed on my finger, and followed the ambulance out. The next morning he showed up shaking. "What did you find?" he asked. I stared at him. Until that moment, I hadn't known there was anything to find. If stories about choosing the people who truly need us speak to you, stay with me for this one. 45 minutes before Claire hit the floor, I was standing beneath the glass roof of a conservatory on the north side of Columbus, convinced I had finally learned how to stop waiting for disaster. June sunlight poured through the panes above us and turned the white flowers along the aisle almost silver. The air conditioning was fighting a losing battle against a warm afternoon and 80 guests in dress clothes, but I barely noticed. I was 38 years old. My daughter was close enough to reach if I stretched out a hand, and the man I had loved through more than a decade of mistakes was finally going to move into my house after we said our vows. For the first time in years, the future felt less like something I had to manage, and more like something I was allowed to enjoy. Ryan and I had never followed the clean version of a love story. We had Claire before we were married. We had survived jobs that changed schedules without warning, bills that arrived at the wrong time, and the tired little arguments that start over dishes and end with two people wondering when they stopped hearing each other. When Claire was 5, Ryan and I separated for almost a year. It had not been dramatic. No police, no smashed plates, no affair that could explain everything in one sentence. We were simply two people who had grown so good at functioning that we stopped knowing how to be kind to each other. He moved into a condo across town. I stayed in the 3-bedroom house Claire already knew as home. We learned to co-parent before we learned how to be a couple again. By the time we reconciled, I was determined not to rush the part that came next. Ryan kept his condo. I kept my house. He had manager-level access on my smart lock because he picked Claire up from school, dropped off forgotten homework, and sometimes got to my place before I did. His condo sat across town in a controlled access building. My house was less than a 10-minute walk from Claire's middle school. The arrangement was practical, and practicality had always been one of the things I loved about him. He could fix a leaking faucet, get a frightened child through a thunderstorm, and figure out which highway exit we needed while I was still opening the map app. After our separation, that reliability had helped me trust him again. The plan was that he would move in after the wedding, not the week before, not gradually enough that I could pretend we had never made a decision. After. I had insisted on that line, and Ryan had respected it. His boxes were still stacked in his condo. One dresser at my house had been emptied for him, but it was still empty. Claire had teased him all month that he was about to graduate from living out of 2 closets. That afternoon, while the photographer was rearranging family members near a wall of climbing ivy, she said it again. "Tomorrow you finally have to keep all your socks in one house." Ryan laughed and reached for her, but Mason called his name from a few feet away. One side of the boy's boutonniere had come loose, and he was holding it like a broken piece of machinery. Ryan turned immediately. He crouched, fixed the pin, straightened Mason's lapel, and checked that it would not stab him through the shirt. It took less than a minute. The photographer had been waiting to take one last picture of Ryan and Claire alone before we lined up for the ceremony. Claire had asked for it that morning because, as she put it, she wanted one photo of her father before he officially became my husband. By the time Ryan finished with Mason, the coordinator was waving us toward the doors, and the photographer said we would catch it after the vows. Claire did not complain. She simply moved into place and told me it was fine. I remember admiring that about her. She had become so easy to disappoint in small ways that I had mistaken it for confidence. At the time, all I saw was a girl mature enough not to make a wedding late over one photograph. Claire caught my eye. "Emergency, Ryan," she said under her breath, smiling. Available 24/7. I smiled back because that was how I heard it then. Affectionate. Familiar? Maybe even a little proud. Mason had lost his father when he was 6. Lauren, his mother, had been my best friend since college, and Ryan had been friends with her husband Daniel too. When Daniel died suddenly, Ryan had helped. Everyone had. Groceries appeared on Lauren's porch. People handled school pickups, yard work, forms, meals, all the ordinary things grief makes impossible. Ryan had been especially good with Mason because he never spoke to him like a fragile child. He showed up, fixed what needed fixing, and stayed normal. I knew all of that. I had never seen it as a threat. What I did notice that afternoon was how tired Claire looked. She had been awake since 6, too excited to eat much breakfast, and she had picked at half a sandwich while the bridesmaids were getting ready. I had pushed a bottle of water into her hand twice. Both times she took a sip and set it down somewhere. Her cheeks were pink from the heat under the conservatory glass. I asked if she wanted to sit out the ceremony, and she rolled her eyes in the way 12-year-old girls do when their mothers have become unreasonable public health agencies. Mom, I'm fine. I'm not missing you getting married because I'm warm. I touched the back of my fingers to her cheek anyway. Then drink water. She took 3 obedient swallows, and I let it go. The ceremony had one detail our officiant had explained twice at rehearsal because I had worried about timing. Ryan would put my band on first. Then I would make the final declaration we had written together. Only after that would the officiant complete the solemnizing words and pronounce us married. I had wanted my last words before the marriage became official to be a promise to Claire, as much as to Ryan. I remember being grateful for that order later. At the time, I was only nervous I would cry before I got the words out. When the music began, Claire sat in the first row, beside my mother's empty chair, where we had placed a small white rose in her memory. Lauren sat on the other side of the aisle, with Mason. He was 13, tall enough that his suit already looked slightly too short in the wrists. I saw him glance toward Ryan twice during the opening remarks. The second time came just after the officiant mentioned that our marriage would join not only 2 people but 2 households. Claire grinned and whispered something to Mason as the officiant paused for the rings. I did not hear all of it, only the end. Because Dad finally moves in after today. Something in Mason's face changed. Not fear exactly. More like a child hearing that a rule he depended on might be changing. He stood when the officiant motioned for the ring box. Mason had agreed to carry it because Claire said ring bearers should be old enough not to eat the rings. He walked the few steps forward, handed the box to Ryan, then hesitated instead of returning to his seat. After today, my code still works, right? He whispered. Ryan's fingers stopped on the box. Mason glanced toward Lauren, then back at him. If something happens to Mom, I still go to your house? The words were quiet, but the room had gone still enough for the people closest to us to hear them. Claire heard them. I saw her turn her head. What code? She asked. Ryan looked at Mason first, then at Claire. His expression tightened for barely a second. If I had not been staring directly at him, I might have missed it. Not now, he said. Mason's face went red. He stepped backward toward his seat. Claire was still looking at her father, confused now instead of amused. The officiant gave us the small, patient smile of someone trying to rescue a ceremony from a child's awkward question. Ryan opened the box, took out my band, and turned back to me. His hand was warm when he lifted mine. I remember thinking I would ask about the code later. I remember thinking there were a dozen harmless explanations. Maybe Ryan had given Mason a temporary pin years ago, during some emergency, and forgotten to mention it. Maybe your house meant Ryan's condo, and Mason had spoken badly. Maybe I had missed a conversation. Trust gives you an astonishing number of ways to explain something before you allow yourself to call it a lie. Ryan slid the band onto my finger. Claire pushed herself up from her chair. Dad! Her voice sounded far away. even though she was only a few feet from me. She took one step toward us. Her face had gone white. I saw her reach for the back of the chair, miss it and sway. Then she went down. She clipped Mason as she fell. He stumbled into the edge of a low metal lantern beside the aisle and scraped his forearm. I heard someone gasp. The officiant jumped backward. The ring box hit the floor. None of those sounds mattered, because Claire did not put out her hands. She did not cry out. She struck the carpeted floor hard enough that I felt the impact through my shoes, and then lay still. I was beside her before I understood I had moved. Claire? Her eyes were closed. Her face looked wrong in the particular way a familiar face does, when it is suddenly empty of response. I put one hand near her shoulder and heard myself say her name again, louder. Ryan moved too. For one split second, I assumed he was dropping beside me. Instead, he stepped around Claire. He caught Mason by both shoulders and pulled the boy toward him. Blood from the scrape on Mason's forearm had already made a thin red line toward his wrist. Ryan looked at it, then at Mason's face. "What did you tell her?" he asked. Lauren was already reaching for her son from the aisle. "Ryan, he's fine." I looked up from Claire. "Ryan, she's not responding." He glanced down at us, but his hand stayed on Mason's arm. My daughter should have been more careful. I did not argue. There are sentences that change your life because they tell you something new. That one changed mine because, in the middle of panic, it told me what Ryan had chosen to notice. Claire was motionless on the floor. Mason had a scrape, and Ryan's first instinct had been to protect Mason, ask what he had said, and assign blame to the child who could not even answer him. My phone was already in my hand. I called 911. The dispatcher asked whether Claire was breathing, whether she had hit her head, whether she had any known medical conditions. I answered as steadily as I could. A nurse who was attending the wedding came forward and knelt near Claire but did not pretend we could diagnose her in a conservatory. We kept her still, watched her breathing, and waited for the paramedics. Somewhere behind me, chairs were moving. Someone guided the older guests away from the aisle. Lauren wrapped a napkin around Mason's scrape. Ryan finally came closer, but by then I did not need him to tell me what to do. Claire stirred before the ambulance arrived. Her eyelids fluttered, and she made a soft, confused sound that nearly broke me. She tried to sit up and the nurse told her not to. Claire looked at me, then at the ceiling, as if she could not understand why the sky had become glass. "Mom, I'm here." That was all I said, because it was the only thing that mattered. The paramedics arrived quickly. They checked her blood pressure, pulse, glucose, and responsiveness, then decided she needed an emergency evaluation because it was her first fainting episode and she had been briefly unresponsive after a fall. Ryan hovered close enough to be useful, but not close enough for me to forget where he had gone first. He started to say something about following us, then looked toward the officiant and the rows of guests. "We can figure out what to do with the ceremony after." I looked at the band on my finger. It had been there less than 10 minutes. I pulled it off. Ryan stopped speaking. I put the ring into his open hand and closed his fingers around it. I did not tell him he had ruined our wedding. I did not call him a terrible father. I did not ask him to explain Mason's code while our daughter was being strapped to a stretcher. There would be time for explanations if I ever wanted them. At that moment, the only decision I trusted myself to make was the one directly in front of me. I followed Claire out. The wedding did not resume. I learned that later from Lauren, but it was not something I had to order. Once the ambulance doors closed, the ceremony had become a room full of flowers around an absence. Ryan did not ride with us. I sat beside Claire in the emergency department while a nurse started fluids and another attached leads for an ECG. The doctor asked about breakfast, water, heat, dizziness, family cardiac history, and whether she remembered anything before she fell. Claire remembered Mason asking about a door code. She remembered asking Ryan what he meant. She remembered Ryan saying, "Not now." After that, there was only a blank space and then the ambulance ceiling. Her exam, vitals, glucose, and ECG were reassuring. After fluids and a few hours of observation, the doctor said the episode looked most consistent with a vasovagal faint, made worse by heat, low food intake, and dehydration. We were told what warning signs would mean coming back, and I promised I would arrange follow-up with her pediatrician. I listened carefully because fear had turned every ordinary instruction into something sacred. Claire, on the other hand, was more worried about something else. "Why did Mason have a code to our house?" she asked. I looked at her. There was no accusation in her face yet, just confusion. "I don't know." "Did you give it to him?" "No." "Did Dad?" I could have lied for another night. I could have told her we would talk when everyone was calmer. That had been my favorite sentence for years, a soft place to put hard things until they stopped looking urgent. "I think he did," I said. Claire stared at the blanket over her knees. "Why?" "I don't know that either." She nodded once, then rested her head against the pillow. I was relieved she did not ask what Ryan had done while she was unconscious, because I was not ready to put that memory inside her yet. She only knew what had happened before she fainted. I was the one who knew what came after. Sitting beside her, I kept remembering every time I had told myself that being reasonable was what saved families. During our separation, I had promised myself I would never again turn one bad moment into a permanent decision. I had learned to wait until tempers cooled, to hear the second version, to ask what stress or grief or fear might be hiding behind someone else's mistake. Those habits had helped Ryan and me rebuild once. That night, for the first time, I wondered whether the same habits could also teach a child that her hurt was always the thing most easily postponed. We got home a little after 10. Claire changed into an old t-shirt, drank the water I put beside her without being reminded, and fell asleep with her bedroom door open. I stood there longer than I needed to, watching the slow rise and fall of her blanket. My dress was wrinkled from hours in a plastic hospital chair. The pins had come loose from my hair. There was a faint pale circle on my finger where the ring had been. My phone held 37 unread messages. I ignored almost all of them. The practical part of my brain took over, because practical things have edges. Ryan had been planning to move in that weekend. His access to my house no longer made sense. I opened the Smart Lock app, went to Users, and removed his manager permissions. Years earlier, I had given him that level of access, because he handled Claire's pickups and drop-offs, and sometimes arrived before me. The app had never asked me to approve each guest pin he created, and my notification settings were limited to lock and unlock activity, not user creation. I had trusted him. Until that night, I had never considered trust a security setting. When I opened the nested guest list under his account, there were 3 old temporary codes I recognized from contractors and family visits. Below them was one active pin I did not recognize at first. Mason S. No expiration date. I stared at the screen long enough for it to dim. My house was less than 10 minutes from Claire and Mason's school. Ryan's condo was across town behind a controlled lobby and a key fob elevator. I understood the convenience immediately. That almost made it worse. Someone had looked at my home, my daughter's home, and decided it was the sensible place to promise another child safety. Maybe Ryan had meant well. Maybe there was an explanation that would make the code look smaller in the morning. But he had never asked me. And Mason had spoken about the promise as if I already knew. I tapped the code and selected Revoke. The app asked me to confirm that removing Ryan's manager access would also disable guest pins created under his profile. I confirmed it. A small banner appeared at the top of the screen. Access revoked. Ryan Mercer. Disabled. Guest pins. Disabled. Mason S. Disabled. I set the phone face down on the kitchen counter and listened to the quiet house. Claire was sleeping upstairs. Ryan was somewhere else with the ring I had returned to him. I thought the biggest thing I had done that day was stop a wedding before it became a marriage. I did not know that deleting one door code had just touched the part of Ryan's life he had worked hardest to keep separate from mine. I slept for maybe 40 minutes that night, if staring at the ceiling with my eyes closed counted as sleep. By 6 in the morning, pale light had begun to push through the blinds in my kitchen, and I was sitting at the table in the same old t-shirt I had pulled on after the hospital. My wedding dress hung over the back of a dining chair, because I had not had the energy to put it away. Every time I looked at it, I saw Claire on the floor instead of myself at the altar. I had made coffee and forgotten to drink it. My phone kept lighting up with messages from relatives, the venue coordinator, the photographer, and people who meant well enough to make me tired. I answered none of them. The only thing I had checked twice was the smart lock app. Ryan Mercer, disabled. Guest pins, disabled. Mason S., disabled. The words had not changed overnight. Claire woke a little after 7. I heard her bedroom door open and was halfway up the stairs before she reached the landing. She looked washed out and embarrassed, as though fainting at my wedding had been a social mistake she needed to apologize for. I made her sit on the couch, brought her water, and put toast on a plate, even though she told me she was not hungry. The doctor had given us simple instructions: fluids, food, rest, pediatric follow-up, and a return to the ER if anything alarming happened. I clung to those instructions because they were the only part of the previous day that made ordinary sense. Claire remembered the moments before she fell clearly enough to bother her. Mason had asked about his code. She had asked Ryan what code. Ryan had shut the question down. Then she remembered getting hot, standing, and the room narrowing around her. After that, nothing until she was in the ambulance. She did not know Ryan had stepped around her to get to Mason. She did not know what he had said while she was unconscious. I had not told her yet. There are truths children deserve, and there are truths adults sometimes need a few hours to learn how to carry before placing them in a child's hands. For the moment, Claire kept circling one question. Why did Mason have a code to our house? I don't know yet, I told her. She pressed the heel of her hand against her forehead. Dad had to give it to him, right? I think so. That was as far as I let it go. Not because I intended to protect Ryan from consequences, but because Claire had spent half the previous day under fluorescent lights with adhesive pads on her chest. She needed breakfast more than she needed adult betrayal before 8 in the morning. I told her she could stay home from everything, that there was nothing she had to fix, explain, or apologize for. She nodded and leaned back against the couch with her water bottle tucked against her stomach. Even exhausted, she was trying to make herself small enough not to add trouble to the room. At 7:43, the keypad at the front door beeped 3 times. The sound was ordinary. I had heard it hundreds of times when Ryan let himself in to pick Claire up or drop something off. That morning, it went through me like an alarm. A second later came another series of beeps, then the doorbell. I looked at the camera feed on my phone. Ryan stood on the porch in jeans and a gray shirt, one hand still near the keypad. He had changed clothes since the wedding, but he looked as if he had not slept either. His face was drawn, his shoulders were rigid. When he lifted his hand to ring the bell again, I saw it shaking. I told Claire to stay on the couch and walked to the door. I did not unlock it immediately. Through the glass panel I could see Ryan glance toward the driveway, then down at his phone. He was not carrying flowers. He was not carrying the ring. He was not holding coffee or breakfast or anything a man might bring when he had spent the night thinking about the daughter who had collapsed in front of him. He looked frightened. I opened the door, but stayed inside the threshold. His eyes went to my face. "What did you find?" For a second, I thought I had misheard him. The question was so far from the one I had expected that my mind could not place it. Not, "How is Claire?" Not, "Can I see her?" Not, "Can we talk about yesterday?" He had skipped past all of that and landed on a question I had no answer for. "Find?" I repeated. Something changed in his expression. It was small, but I knew Ryan too well not to see it. His mouth tightened. His eyes moved away from mine for half a beat. He had asked the wrong question, and we both knew it at exactly the same time. He recovered quickly. That was one of the things Ryan was good at. He could walk into a broken situation and make himself useful before anyone else had decided where to start. He told me the lock app had alerted him that his access and the guest codes were gone. I said they were. His hand opened and closed at his side. "You can't do that." I asked what exactly I could not do. He glanced toward the hallway behind me and said, "I could not just wipe everything out overnight." I reminded him it was my house. He said that was not what he meant, so I made him explain. After a silence long enough for me to hear the refrigerator humming behind me, he finally said, "Mason needs that code." There it was. Not my access. Not the logistics of Claire's pickups. Mason. I asked why Mason needed permanent access to my house. Ryan said I was making it sound more permanent than it was. To him, the code was only a backup. I pointed out that it had no expiration date. He said it was for emergencies if Lauren got stuck, if something happened after school, if Mason needed somewhere safe and she could not get to him. My house was close. His was not. To Ryan, that made the decision practical. The explanation was exactly what I had already worked out for myself the night before, and hearing him say it did not make it better. It made it worse. Convenience was not consent. Geography was not permission. You decided my house made sense. Aaron, come on. No. You came here shaking because I removed a code you never told me existed. So don't tell me to come on. Tell me who gave you permission to promise my house to someone else's child. His jaw tightened at the phrase someone else's child. Mason isn't just some kid. I didn't say he was. You know what he's been through. I did. That was what made Ryan's defense so effective. Mason had been 6 when Daniel died. I had watched Lauren forget how to finish sentences for weeks. I had brought food to her house, sat with her while Mason slept, handled school forms when she could barely read them. I had seen Ryan repair a loose porch rail, fix a broken cabinet hinge, take Mason out for burgers. When the boy could not stand another adult, asking how he felt. None of that had seemed wrong. None of it had been wrong. Grief creates emergencies. And people who love you are supposed to show up. But grief did not give Ryan ownership of my front door. I know what Mason went through, I said. That's not the question. Ryan rubbed one hand over his face. The shaking had lessened now that he was talking, but I could still see tension in his fingers. I gave him a safe place. That's all. All? Yes. How long has he had the code? Ryan hesitated. A while. How long? A couple of years. The porch seemed to tilt, not dramatically, just enough to remind me that the ground beneath a familiar life can shift without making a sound. A couple of years meant this had not been a hurried decision after one bad afternoon. Ryan had created the code, left it active, and watched me walk past that keypad thousands of times without mentioning it. I thought about every ordinary evening he had unlocked my door. Every time I had thanked him for bringing Claire's backpack over. Every time I had looked at the app and seen his name under authorized users without thinking further. Trust had made the hidden thing invisible, because I had never believed I needed to audit him. Has Mason ever used it when neither of us was here? I asked. Ryan shook his head too fast. That's not the point. It was not an answer, and I noticed that. I also noticed something else. I was asking about the code, but Ryan was defending an arrangement. There was a difference. He lowered his voice. You would never leave Mason standing outside if Lauren couldn't get to him. That is not the same as giving him permanent access without asking me. He lost his father. The words landed exactly where Ryan intended them to. They were not an explanation. They were a moral weight. If I objected, I became the woman taking safety away from a fatherless child. If I accepted the premise, Ryan never had to answer why he had made the decision in secret. I looked at him for a long moment. Claire almost stopped breathing in my head yesterday. His face changed. She didn't stop breathing. I know that now. I kept my voice quiet because Claire was 20 feet away. Yesterday I didn't. She was on the floor and not responding, and you stepped over her to get to Mason. Ryan said he had panicked and pointed out that Mason was bleeding. I reminded him it had been a scrape, and that his first question had still been what Mason told Claire. Ryan closed his eyes for a second. I know how it looked. That sentence almost made me laugh, except there was nothing funny in me. How it looked, as if the problem were the angle from which I had watched it. I'm not asking you to explain the wedding right now, I said. I'm asking one question. Does Lauren know Mason has a standing code to my house? Yes. Does she think I know? Ryan did not answer. I felt my pulse in my throat. Ryan. He looked past me again. Lauren doesn't need to be dragged into this. The evasion was more useful than a confession. Until then, part of me had still been trying to shrink the situation into something I could understand. Ryan made an overstep. Mason knew about it. Lauren probably assumed it was casual. But if the answer were simple, Ryan would have said yes or no. Instead, he was protecting the space between what Lauren believed and what I knew. Behind me, Claire called. Mom? Ryan's face shifted immediately toward the sound. Can I see her? I turned enough to answer Claire that I was fine and would be in shortly. Then I faced him again. I did not want her first morning home to become a doorway confrontation between her parents. Not now. His eyebrows lifted. Aaron, I'm her father. I know exactly who you are. She is resting. You can call her later when she's up to it. For a moment he looked ready to argue. Then his shoulders dropped. He glanced at the keypad, and I saw the same fear return, not anger at being kept out, but something more specific attached to what I had disabled. You need to put Mason's code back, he said. No. Please don't make this about him. I'm not. You are. That was the end of the conversation. I closed the door before either of us could turn it into a fight that would only give Ryan more places to hide. Through the camera, I watched him stand on the porch for several seconds. He checked his phone, looked toward the house, then walked back to his car. He did not knock again. Claire had moved from the couch to the kitchen table by the time I turned around. She was still pale, but irritation had replaced some of the fragility in her face. Was that Dad? Yes. Did he say why Mason had the code? I poured more water into her bottle, even though it was already half full. He said it was for emergencies. She considered that. Like what kind? He wasn't very clear. Claire looked down at the toast she had barely touched. Mason sounded like he thought he could come here if something happened to his mom. I sat across from her. That's what it sounded like to me too. She waited. I could see the next question forming, but she did not ask it. Instead, she tore the corner off her toast and said, I'm tired. Then go lie down. She nodded, relieved to be given permission to leave the subject unfinished. I watched her walk upstairs and understood something I had not wanted to understand the night before. Claire was not the only person in our house who had learned to survive uncomfortable things by postponing them. Once she was settled, I picked up my phone and called Lauren. I almost texted first. That would have been easier. A message gives everyone time to prepare the version of events they want to send back. But Ryan's silence on the porch had taken away my patience for prepared versions. Lauren answered on the fourth ring. Her voice sounded cautious before I said anything, which made sense. The last time we had been in the same room, her son had been bleeding, my daughter had been unconscious, and my wedding had ended without a marriage. Is Claire okay? She asked. She's home. She's resting. The ER thinks it was a vasovagal faint with dehydration and heat. We're following up with her doctor. Lauren let out a breath. Thank God. For a second, we were simply two mothers who had spent the previous day terrified in different ways. I let that second exist. Then I asked the question I had promised myself I would keep narrow. Did you know Mason had a standing code to my house? Silence. It did not sound guilty to me. It sounded confused. Yes, Lauren said finally. Of course. The words were so casual that I tightened my grip on the phone. Of course? Ryan set it up. For emergencies. Did you know I didn't? Another pause. Didn't what? Didn't set it up. Didn't approve it. Didn't know it existed until last night. Lauren did not answer immediately. When she did, the defensiveness in her voice was gone. Aaron, I thought you knew. I closed my eyes. Hearing the phrase again made the pattern impossible to dismiss. The sentence I had been circling since Mason spoke at the wedding. Not I thought Ryan told you recently. Not I assumed you wouldn't mind. I thought you knew. Why? I asked. Because Ryan said you did. My kitchen suddenly felt too quiet. The refrigerator clicked off. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked as Claire moved in bed. What exactly did he say I knew? Lauren sounded unsettled now, as if she were opening a cabinet she had always believed belonged to both of us, and finding my side empty. The emergency plan. That Mason had the code. That if I got stuck or something happened and he needed somewhere safe, he could go there. Ryan said you were okay with it. I stared at the pale mark where my wedding ring had been. Lauren, I have never had that conversation with Ryan. I don't understand. Neither do I. She was quiet for several seconds. Then she said, I thought you just didn't like talking about it. That sentence was worse. Why would you think that? Because Ryan told me the whole thing made you uncomfortable. She spoke slowly now, as if testing every word before letting it out. He said you understood why Mason needed continuity, but you didn't want to be involved in the details. I thought that was your boundary. I thought bringing it up with you would be pushing. I leaned back in my chair. Ryan had not merely failed to tell me something. He had apparently built an explanation for my silence and delivered it to my best friend. Every year I had not asked about an arrangement I did not know existed had become proof, in Lauren's world, that I preferred not to discuss it. What emergency plan? I asked. Lauren exhaled. Aaron, maybe this is better in person. No, not yet. Just tell me what you thought I agreed to. She hesitated long enough that I could hear traffic passing outside her house through the phone. After Daniel died, Mason got scared about what would happen if something happened to me too. It wasn't constant, but there were nights when he'd ask who would come get him, where he'd go, whether he'd have to leave school. Ryan was good with him. He told Mason he would never let him be stranded. I waited. Lauren continued, softer now. Later, Ryan said, if I was ever in the hospital or unreachable or there was some real emergency, Mason could go to your place because it was close to school. He said there would always be a way for him to get inside and wait somewhere safe. My fingers went cold around the phone. That was bigger than a pin. The code was only the physical piece of something Ryan had already described to a child as reliable. Did you ask him if I had agreed? I did. And? Lauren's voice broke slightly on the answer. He said yes. I got up from the table because sitting still had become impossible. I walked to the sink, then back, then stopped beside the chair where my wedding dress still hung. The house around me looked exactly the same as it had 2 days earlier. Same walls, same locks, same school papers on the refrigerator. Yet, I was beginning to understand that another version of my home had existed in other people's minds for years. In that version, I had said yes to things I had never been asked. How much did Mason think was promised? I asked. I don't know how to answer that without making it sound more formal than it was. Lauren was choosing her words carefully now. It wasn't custody paperwork. It wasn't anything legal. But Ryan made him feel like he had a backup. Like if something happened to me, he wouldn't just get passed around or sent somewhere he didn't know. I closed my eyes. Sent somewhere. The phrase from the outline of Mason's fear at the wedding came back to me with new weight. If something happens to Mom, I still go to your house? He had not been asking about convenience. He had been checking whether a promise survived my marriage. Lauren, I said, what did Ryan tell you my role was in that? She was silent again. When she answered, the certainty was gone from her voice, replaced by something much closer to fear. Ryan told me you agreed he would be Mason's backup if I couldn't be there. Someone had been speaking for me inside a family arrangement I had never joined. For the next 2 days, Claire recovered in the most ordinary way possible, which somehow made everything else feel stranger. She drank water without being reminded, complained about being bored, and asked whether passing out at a wedding legally counted as getting out of summer reading. Her pediatrician reviewed the emergency room notes, repeated the same precautions we had already been given, and told us to pay attention to food, fluids, heat, and any new symptoms. Nothing in that conversation suggested a hidden illness or a medical mystery. By Monday afternoon, the bruised place on Claire's hip bothered her more than the fainting itself. She wanted the episode to become embarrassing history as quickly as possible. I understood that instinct because I had spent years doing my own version of it. If something could be made ordinary, I made it ordinary. A hard week became stress. A missed promise became bad timing. A silence became someone needing space. I had always thought that was emotional maturity. Now I was beginning to wonder how often I had used reasonable explanations to keep myself from looking directly at a pattern. Ryan called twice the day after he came to my door. I let both calls go to voicemail. His messages were brief. He asked how Claire was feeling, said he wanted to talk when I was ready, and then, in the second message, returned to Mason's access code. He said there were things I didn't understand yet, and that disabling the plan without knowing the whole story could hurt people who had nothing to do with our wedding. I did not call him back. The phrase, whole story, stayed with me because it was the first honest thing he had said by accident. Lauren and I exchanged only 2 texts after our phone call. The first was from her. We need to talk in person. The second was mine. Tomorrow. No kids in the conversation. No Ryan. She came to my house late the next morning while Mason was at a day program through his school, and Claire was upstairs watching a movie. Lauren arrived carrying nothing. No coffee, no apology gift, no folder of proof. I was grateful for that. I did not want props. I wanted to understand how my best friend had spent years believing I had agreed to something I had never heard about. She stopped just inside the front door and looked at the keypad. It was a tiny movement, but I saw it. The same keypad had become a different object for both of us in 48 hours. I didn't know. You didn't know, she said. I believed that she believed the sentence. That did not make it painless. We sat at the kitchen table, where Ryan and I had discussed wedding seating 6 days earlier. I had removed the dress from the chair, but the room still seemed crowded with everything that had changed. Lauren folded her hands around each other and kept looking at them. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. At first, she was defensive. Not loud. Lauren had never been someone who became louder when she was scared. She became precise. She reminded me that Ryan's help had started during the worst year of her life, that I had known he was helping, that none of us had treated it as suspicious then. She said Mason had been 6 years old when Daniel died, and had started checking the front window every time an adult was 5 minutes late. She said there were months when just getting him to school without a panic attack felt like winning something. I told her I knew. I had been there, and so had Ryan. She looked up at me then, almost pleading with the history itself. So, when you ask me now how this happened, I don't have some moment where everything suddenly changed. That was the first thing she said that helped. I did not ask her to justify Ryan. I asked her to tell me how the help had grown. Daniel died in March of 2020, during the 11 months Ryan and I were living apart. I remembered those months clearly. My life had been divided into calendars. Claire with me, Claire with Ryan, work deadlines, School pickup, therapy appointments. Ryan and I attended separately before we were willing to sit in the same room. Lauren's grief had existed beside all of that like weather. No one could control. Ryan had known Daniel well by then. Not from Mason's infancy. They had only become close after Lauren and Daniel moved back to Columbus when Mason was a toddler, but well enough that Daniel's death hit him hard too. Ryan started doing the kinds of things people do when a friend dies and leaves behind a family. He fixed a railing Lauren had been meaning to call someone about. He took Mason to get a haircut before school pictures. He handled an after-school pickup when Lauren had to deal with insurance paperwork. He drove them to a cardiology appointment because Lauren could not stop shaking long enough to trust herself behind the wheel. I knew about those things. Some of them I had helped arrange. There was no secret in the beginning. That fact mattered because betrayal is easier to understand when you can point to the first lie. This did not give me one. It gave me a slope. Lauren said that after Ryan and I reconciled late that year, she expected him to step back naturally. Not disappear, just return to being a family friend instead of the person she called when a faucet broke and Mason refused to sleep. He told me you understood why he couldn't just vanish on Mason, she said. I felt my shoulders tighten. He told you I said that? Not those exact words. He said you understood Mason needed continuity. That word again. Continuity. Ryan had used it on the porch as if a clinical-sounding word could turn a private promise into a responsible plan. Lauren said she had asked, more than once, whether the situation was becoming uncomfortable for me. Ryan's answer had always been some version of the same thing. Aaron knows. Aaron gets it. Aaron doesn't want to be pulled into every detail because it makes things awkward, but she understands. I sat with that for a moment. What exactly was supposed to be awkward for me? Lauren pressed her lips together. You and Ryan getting back together. Me depending on him. Daniel being gone. All of it. And you never asked me? The question came out sharper than I intended. Her face tightened. No. I waited. She looked toward the stairs, then back at me. I should have. That was not enough to repair anything, but it was the first place she stopped defending herself. She explained that Ryan had framed my silence as a boundary. If I did not bring up Mason's arrangements, it was because I preferred not to. Lauren had respected what she believed was a painful subject by routing practical things directly through Ryan. School pickup changes, emergency contacts, occasional events, questions about what Mason should do if she was delayed. She thought she was avoiding putting me in the middle. The result was almost elegant in its cruelty. I did not know enough to ask. Lauren believed asking me would violate a boundary. Ryan sat between us, translating each woman's silence into permission for the other. I asked what practical things meant. Lauren inhaled slowly. Ryan had been listed as an emergency contact at Mason's school for years. Not as a guardian, not as someone with custody, just one of the adults, authorized to be called if Lauren could not be reached. He had picked Mason up from school when Lauren was stuck with a client. He had attended a couple of parent-facing events when Lauren could not get away. Once, when Mason had panicked during a field trip meeting because parents were being asked to discuss emergency procedures, Ryan had shown up because Lauren was across town. I knew pieces of that. Not all of it, but enough that none of them would have alarmed me alone. That was the problem. There had never been one giant secret action large enough to force the truth into daylight. There had been dozens of small actions, each with a respectable explanation. Then Lauren told me about the first time Ryan called my house a safe place. It had been during a winter storm, 2 names, early names, school dismissed early. Lauren was stuck behind an accident on the interstate, and Ryan was across town at a job site. Mason was old enough to walk from school, but Lauren did not want him alone outside if she could not reach the neighborhood quickly. Ryan apparently told her that my house was close, and that Mason could use a code if he needed to wait inside. Did he come here? I asked. No, I got home before he left the school building. The fact should have comforted me. It did not. The promise had existed whether Mason used it or not. And after that? Lauren said Ryan kept the code active. She assumed I knew because Ryan told her I did. The code became part of the background, like knowing where a spare key was kept. Mason was instructed not to use it casually. He did not come to my house after school to hang out. He did not let himself in to raid the refrigerator. That almost made the arrangement more unsettling, because it had been treated seriously. It was not a child taking advantage of my home. It was adults assigning my home a role without asking me. Lauren rubbed at a faint scratch on the tabletop with one fingertip. He told Mason that if there was ever a real problem, and I wasn't available, your house was somewhere he could go. My house? Yes. Not Ryan's condo. You know how hard his building is to get into without him. And you're close to the school. I nodded once. I knew the logic. I had known it the night I saw Mason's name in the app. What I could not accept was how easily everyone else's practicality had crossed the border of my consent. A memory surfaced then, so ordinary that I almost dismissed it before it finished forming. Claire had been 9. Ryan had taken her to an indoor climbing gym on a Saturday. They were supposed to get lunch afterward. He brought her home 2 hours early because Lauren had called about something involving Mason. I could not remember the exact emergency. A school project maybe. A ride. Something that had seemed important in the moment and forgettable afterward. Claire had stood in the hallway, still wearing her climbing shoes. Disappointed, but trying not to show it. Ryan had kissed the top of her head and told her they would finish their day another time. I had said, "Your dad's helping Mason. You know he's had a rough time." Claire had nodded. I had been proud of her for not complaining. The memory felt different now. Not because helping Mason had suddenly become wrong, but because I could see how quickly Claire had been asked to understand. Another one came behind it. Ryan changing a weekend because Lauren had a bookkeeping deadline and Mason had an event. Claire asking if he would still come to a school showcase. Ryan arriving late enough to miss the part she had practiced. I remembered him crouching beside her afterward and saying, Mason did not have what she had. He had said it gently, almost lovingly. At the time, I had heard gratitude inside the sentence. Be thankful you have both parents. Now I heard the other lesson. Because you have more, you can be given less. I did not tell Lauren every memory. I did not need to. My face must have changed because she stopped talking and asked if I was okay. No, I said, but keep going. She looked miserable. There had been times, she admitted, when she wondered if Ryan was becoming too involved. Once Mason started middle school, she had tried to move more responsibilities back to herself. She had a stable business by then. The fog of early grief had lifted. Mason was older. She no longer needed someone to rescue every bad afternoon. I told Ryan that, she said. I said I didn't want Mason thinking he couldn't handle anything without him. What did Ryan say? Lauren looked away. He said I shouldn't make Mason lose another stable man just because I felt guilty about needing help. I did not answer. It was not enough information to explain Ryan yet. I knew that. People say clumsy things when they are attached to a child. People mistake continuity for obligation. People overcorrect after tragedy. I did not want to turn one sentence into a diagnosis just because I was angry. But I noticed it. Lauren had tried to reduce the help. Ryan had framed reduction as another loss. That mattered. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Lauren lowered her voice. Does Claire know any of this? Not much. She heard Mason at the wedding. She remembers that. Lauren flinched. He feels terrible about it. He didn't do anything wrong. I know. I believed her. For the first time since the wedding, I felt something close to grief for Mason without anger attached to it. He had walked into that ceremony believing a promise existed. He had asked whether it would survive a change in Ryan's household, because adults had taught him the promise was real. He had not exposed a secret maliciously. He had checked the stability of the only arrangement he thought he could trust. The unfairness of that settled between Lauren and me. Mason had not created the secret. Claire had not created the secret. Neither child had asked to be put on opposite sides of it. I was about to ask Lauren another question when Claire appeared halfway down the stairs. She had changed into shorts and one of Ryan's old college t-shirts that she had stolen years ago and turned into pajamas. Seeing it on her made something twist inside me. She looked from me to Lauren. "Am I interrupting?" "Yes," I said gently. "But it's okay." Lauren started to stand. Claire waved her back down. "I just wanted water." She came into the kitchen, filled a glass, and leaned against the counter. I could tell by her expression that she had heard enough to know we were talking about Ryan and Mason. 12-year-olds do not need entire conversations. A few names, one lowered voice, one unfinished sentence, and they can feel the shape of a problem. Claire looked at Lauren. "Did Mason get in trouble because he told me about the code?" Lauren's face softened. "No, absolutely not." "Okay." Claire took a drink. She did not leave. I knew that pause. She was deciding whether she was allowed to ask the real question. Was Dad supposed to be Mason's dad too? The room went still. Lauren's eyes moved to me. I hated that my daughter had found a question none of the adults had been brave enough to ask directly. "I don't know what your dad thought he was supposed to be," I said. "I'm still finding that out." Claire stared into her glass. There was one thing she had a right to know, and delaying it now would only repeat the habit I was beginning to distrust in myself. I moved the chair beside me, out with my foot. "Come sit down." She hesitated, then sat. I kept my voice plain, no dramatic language. No attempt to make Ryan sound worse than what had happened. "You remember falling at the wedding?" She nodded. "You remember everything up until you got dizzy, but not what happened while you were out." Another nod. "When you fell, you bumped Mason and he scraped his arm. I was with you on the floor. Your dad went to Mason first." Claire did not react immediately. I continued because stopping halfway would make her fill the silence herself. "He checked Mason's arm and asked what Mason had told you. I called 911. He did come over to you afterward, but I need you to know what happened because I don't want other people knowing pieces of your own story that you don't." Her mouth tightened. "How long?" "What? How long was he with Mason before me?" The question broke my heart because it sounded like measurement, as if there might be a number of seconds small enough to make the choice harmless. "It was brief," I said. "But it happened." Claire nodded once, then again smaller. "Was Mason hurt bad?" "No, a scrape." She looked toward Lauren. "I'm not mad at him." Lauren's eyes shone. "He isn't mad at you either." Claire stood up before either of us could make the moment heavier. "Okay, I'm going back upstairs." I almost stopped her. The mother in me wanted to make sure she was processing correctly, wanted her to say what she felt so I could fix whatever came next. But children are allowed to leave rooms. Adults have made too complicated. I let her go. When her bedroom door closed upstairs, Lauren covered her mouth with one hand. "I'm sorry," she said. I looked at her. She lowered her hand. "Not just for yesterday. I should have asked you. Years ago. I should have asked you directly." "Yes," I said. The answer hurt her. I could see that. I did not soften it. She nodded. "I know." We sat in silence for a while. Our friendship did not repair itself because she admitted fault. Mine did not become blameless because Ryan had lied. There were too many years inside the space between us. Still, for the first time since the wedding, Lauren and I were looking at the same version of events. That alone changed the room. I asked her one final question before she left. "What exactly did Ryan promise Mason?" Lauren's fingers tightened around the strap of her purse. "I don't know every version of what he said. I wasn't there for every conversation. Tell me what you do know. She took a breath. There was a night, maybe a year after Daniel died, when Mason got scared because I had the flu. Nothing serious, but he was 7, and I was in bed all day. He asked Ryan what would happen if I couldn't take care of him. I waited. Lauren looked directly at me. Ryan told him, "If your mom can't take care of you, you come to us." Us. Not me. Not call me. Not I'll help. Us. Ryan had not only promised himself to Mason, he had promised me too. That sentence stayed with me after Lauren left. It followed me upstairs when I checked on Claire and into the bedroom where one dresser drawer still sat empty for Ryan. I had spent months making room for a man who had been making promises with my name in them. By late afternoon, Ryan had left another voicemail. This time he did not mention the lock. He said he wanted to talk about what happened at the wedding and that he owed me an apology. He sounded tired, not frantic. The difference mattered. Panic had made him careless the morning before. Now he had time to choose his words. I did not call him back until Claire was showered, fed, and settled on the couch with a movie. Her color had returned. The bruise on her hip had turned a deep purple, but her dizziness was gone. I told her Ryan had asked to speak to me. She lifted one shoulder and said she did not care, which was the kind of answer that usually meant she cared too much. I asked Ryan to come by after dinner. I did not invite him inside. He arrived just after 7. I met him on the back patio because Claire's bedroom windows faced the front of the house, and I did not want another conversation at the door becoming part of her evening. The air was still warm, and the chairs we had bought for the wedding weekend barbecue were lined up against the fence. Ryan noticed them. His eyes moved over the unopened paper lanterns, stacked near the garage, then back to me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "I'm sorry for what I said about Claire." I had expected an apology. What surprised me was how quickly my mind supplied the rest of the sentence for him. I panicked. "I didn't mean it. You know I love her." Ryan gave me all 3. He said everything happened at once, that the line about Claire being more careful had been cruel and stupid, and that he regretted it before the ambulance left. He did not ask me to pretend it had not happened. That made the apology harder to dismiss. I listened until he finished. Then I said, "Claire was unconscious, and your first question to Mason was what he had told her." Ryan looked down at the concrete between his shoes. I continued, "That is the part you keep trying to separate from the sentence. I'm not separating it." His shoulders tightened. "I already told you. Mason had just said something he wasn't supposed to bring up in the middle of the ceremony. Something you had told him was true." "Yes. And something you had told Lauren I knew about." He rubbed a hand across the back of his neck. "Yes." The words sat between us without excuses for once. I asked him what he had actually promised. Ryan leaned back against the patio rail. "I promised I would always be there for Mason." The answer was simple enough to sound honorable. It was also too large to be useful. "What does always mean?" His eyes came up. "It means what it sounds like." "No, it doesn't. Picking him up from school is being there. Giving him access to my house without telling me is something else. Telling him to come to us if Lauren can't take care of him is something else. So tell me what always means." Ryan's expression hardened in a way I had seen during arguments about money or schedules, when he felt I was taking something practical and making it emotional. Daniel was my friend. He died. Mason was 6. You know what that did to him. I did know. That was the piece Ryan kept placing in front of every question, and it worked because it was true. Daniel had died. Mason had been 6. Ryan had shown up when showing up mattered. Ryan said he had promised Daniel's family he would not disappear from Mason's life. He spoke about it as loyalty, almost duty. If a friend died and left a child behind, he said, decent people did not measure every ride to school against whether it was technically their responsibility. Nothing in that argument was wrong by itself. That was what made it dangerous. "I'm not asking why you helped him after Daniel died," I said. I'm asking why helping him required you to tell Lauren I had agreed to things I had never heard about. Ryan's jaw moved. You're making compassion sound dirty, he said. He had turned the question into a moral position instead of answering it. If you make this into something shameful, what do you think that does to Mason? I felt something inside me go very still. I have not said one shameful thing about Mason. You're acting like every time I showed up for him was some betrayal of Claire. No, I'm asking why you hid the scope of it. He needed consistency. Claire needed her father. She had me. The speed of the answer caught me. Ryan seemed to hear it too, because he added, She still does. I watched him for a moment. You talk about Mason like you're responsible for what he needs. You talk about Claire like she's supposed to understand what everyone else needs. That's not fair. Isn't it? He exhaled sharply. Claire is strong. She has always been strong. The word landed differently now. Strong. I had used it too. I had called Claire mature when she stopped complaining. Flexible when plans changed. Thoughtful when she accepted less than she wanted, because someone else had a sadder reason. Ryan kept talking. He said Claire knew she was loved. She knew both her parents were there. Mason did not have that security. Mason had lost a father and spent years afraid that other people might disappear too. According to Ryan, giving him one adult who did not leave had been the humane thing to do. I listened to the language, what Mason needs, what is best for him. I'm not going to disappear on him. Then, when Claire entered the sentence, the words changed. She understands. She's resilient. She has us. Ryan was not describing two children he loved differently. He was describing one child as a responsibility and the other as a resource. I did not say that out loud yet. It was too new, and I did not trust myself to make a final truth out of a pattern I had only just learned to see. Instead, I asked, Why did you tell Lauren I agreed? He looked away. Ryan. I told her you understood. That isn't what she heard. I can't control every sentence Lauren remembers from 6 years ago. You told her I understood. You told her I didn't want to be involved in details. You told her Mason could use my house. You told Mason to come to us. That is not one sentence remembered wrong. Ryan pushed away from the railing and paced 2 steps across the patio. You want me to say I handled it perfectly? I didn't. I should have talked to you more. More? He stopped. I almost laughed at the word. More implied there had been a conversation to continue. There was no first conversation. His face tightened. For the first time that evening, he looked less apologetic than cornered. He said I was taking years of grief, friendship, and responsibility, and reducing them to permissions and technicalities. He reminded me that he had known Daniel, that he had helped carry boxes out of Lauren's house after the funeral because she could not stand looking at them, that he had been the one Mason called the first time a school assignment about fathers sent him into a bathroom stall crying. Those details hurt because I could picture them. They also raised the question I had been avoiding. How long had he been functioning not as a helpful friend but as something closer to a parent? Ryan seemed to see the question change my face. What? He asked. I did not answer immediately. Then I said, Lauren told me what you said to Mason when she had the flu. His expression went blank. If your mom can't take care of you, you come to us. He looked away. You remember saying it? Yes. What did you mean by us? You and me. The bluntness of the answer hurt more than evasion. You volunteered me. I thought by then you knew the situation. No. You told people I knew the situation. Ryan's mouth tightened. I asked the question that had been sitting at the edge of my mind since Claire asked whether her father was supposed to be Mason's father too. Why does this sound like you were building another family? Ryan stared at me. Shock flashed across his face, then anger. Don't turn Lauren into that. I didn't say anything about Lauren. You didn't have to. His defensiveness told me I had reached the conclusion his choices made hard to ignore. He had made father-level promises to his friend's widow and son, lied to me about the scope, used my house, then reacted to Mason's disclosure as if something dangerous had been exposed. There was an obvious explanation, and I hated that it was obvious. Was there ever anything between you and Lauren? Ryan's face changed from anger to disbelief. No. Ever? No. Is Mason your son? He actually took a step backward. No. The answer came instantly. I did not know whether instant meant true or practiced. Trust had lost the privilege of being automatic. Ryan stared at me. Daniel was my friend. And I was supposed to marry you 3 days ago. I never slept with Lauren. I said nothing. His voice lowered. Mason is Daniel's son. I wanted the sentence to settle the question. It did not. Not yet. I had no evidence against it. I simply no longer trusted Ryan's word automatically. He saw that. You're serious? Yes. He looked sick. For a moment, the conversation stopped being strategic. He sat down in one of the patio chairs and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. The anger drained out of him. He told me there had never been an affair. Not during our separation, not before it, not after it. He said his relationship with Lauren had always been tied to Daniel and Mason. He sounded more wounded by that suspicion than by anything else I had asked. I believed that he was wounded. I did not yet know whether I believed the denial. What I did know was that the question existed because of choices Ryan had made. He had created a relationship structure that looked parental, hidden it from me, and then acted offended when I tried to name what I was seeing. I told him that. He did not answer. The next morning, Lauren called before I had decided whether I wanted to ask her the same question. She saved me the effort by bringing it up herself. Ryan called me last night, she said. I closed my eyes. Of course he did. He said you asked if Mason was his. There was no accusation in her voice at first, just exhaustion. I did. A pause. Then Lauren said, "He isn't." I stood at the kitchen window while she spoke. Claire was outside on the back step, slowly eating a bowl of cereal because she had decided sunlight counted as recovery. I kept my voice low. Lauren was offended. I could hear it, even though she tried to stay controlled. She said there had never been anything romantic between her and Ryan. Not once. She said Daniel had been Mason's father in every sense of the word. Then, because she understood why words alone might not be enough for me anymore, she walked me through the chronology without dramatizing it. Lauren and Daniel had lived out of state when Mason was born. They stayed there through his infancy. Ryan and I were in Columbus. Ryan knew Lauren through me, but he was not part of their daily family life. He had not been there for the pregnancy. He had not been around when Mason was a baby. Lauren and Daniel moved back to Columbus when Mason was already a toddler. Only after that did Daniel and Ryan become close through neighborhood projects, weekend games, and the kind of friendships men sometimes build sideways while fixing things together. The dates were ordinary. That was why they were convincing. There was no hidden gap in the timeline where Ryan had secretly occupied the role I had begun to imagine. His closeness to Mason came later. Daniel was alive. Daniel was present. Ryan entered as Daniel's friend. I felt embarrassed by how much relief washed through me. Then I felt angry at myself for being relieved, because disproving one kind of betrayal did not erase the one already in front of me. Lauren must have heard the change in my breathing. "I understand why you asked," she said. I leaned against the counter. "Do you?" "Yes." There was a long pause. Then she added, "I hate that I understand why." That was the closest either of us came to comfort. I asked her something I had not been able to answer after speaking to Ryan. If there was never anything between you, why did his role get so big? Lauren was quiet. "I thought you knew," she said finally. That was always the answer. It sounded less like a defense now, and more like an admission of how little she understood too. She said she had believed Ryan's involvement was acceptable because he repeatedly told her I had accepted it. She had never thought of him as replacing Daniel. She had thought of him as the adult who stayed when things were hard. At first, that distinction had been clear. Over time, apparently, it had blurred for everyone except me. I ended the call without trying to force Lauren into an explanation she did not have. I tried to work from home and failed. The wedding had made the pattern visible, and my mind kept searching backward for places I had walked past it. Around noon, Claire appeared in my office doorway carrying 2 glasses of water. She had turned the doctor's hydration instructions into a household enforcement program. "You're bad at this," she said, putting my glass beside the keyboard. "At drinking water? At doing what doctors tell you?" I smiled despite myself. "Thank you." She stayed in the doorway. I knew better than to fill the silence for her. After a moment, she asked whether Ryan was going to come over. "I don't know." She looked at the carpet. "Did you ask him if he's Mason's dad?" The question startled me. "Why would you ask that?" Claire shrugged, but her shoulders had gone stiff. "Because that's what it sounds like. Children sometimes follow the emotional shape adults leave in front of them faster than adults do." I told her I had asked, and that, as far as I could establish, Ryan was not Mason's biological father. There had been no affair between Ryan and Lauren. I kept it simple, and did not ask whether she felt relieved. Claire nodded. Then she said, "So he just wanted to do all that?" The word just cut through everything. I looked at her. "I don't know yet," I said. She moved toward the hall, then stopped. "There was this one Saturday," she said. Her voice had changed. Not dramatic. Careful. She was 9. Ryan had promised to take her to a science museum exhibit she had been talking about for weeks. I remembered the day only vaguely until she described it. They had breakfast together. Claire had packed a little notebook because she wanted to write down facts about space. Then Ryan got a call from Lauren. Mason had a school event that afternoon, something connected to a project he had worked hard on, and Lauren had a client problem she could not leave. Ryan canceled the museum. Claire told me she cried. That part I did not remember. "I told Dad it wasn't fair," she said. "I said Mason already had people at school." I held still. Claire looked toward the window rather than at me. "Dad said, 'You have me all the time. He doesn't.'" The sentence seemed to remove air from the room. Then I remembered the aftermath. Ryan had brought Claire home. She had been quiet. He had explained that Mason's event mattered because the boy had lost his father and needed someone in the audience. I had agreed. I had looked at Claire's disappointed face and praised her for understanding. I had told her I was proud of her. At the time, I thought I was teaching empathy. Now I saw what else I had taught. If another child's pain was greater, Claire's disappointment became selfish. I closed the laptop. "Did I say something like you were being mature about it?" Claire gave me a small, almost apologetic smile. "You said I was a really good kid." I looked down at my hands. The memory hurt because no one in it had been trying to be cruel. Ryan wanted a fatherless boy not to stand alone. I wanted Claire to grow into someone generous. Claire wanted her father to keep a promise. Only one of those wants had been treated as negotiable. "I'm sorry," I said. Claire looked uncomfortable with the apology, as if she had not brought up the memory to make me feel guilty. "I'm not mad about the museum anymore." I know. And I did know. The museum was not the point. She had stopped crying that day, because Ryan gave her a moral reason to stop. I had rewarded her for accepting it. Years later, when Ryan left a father-daughter afternoon early, or arrived late to something because Mason needed him, Claire already knew the rule. "You have me all the time. He doesn't." By the time she was 12, she no longer needed anyone to repeat it. She had learned to repeat it for them. That evening, Ryan called again. I almost let it ring out, then answered, because I wanted one question resolved before the day ended. He began by saying he was sorry I had felt forced to ask Lauren about an affair. He said he could understand how things looked now, but he wanted me to remember what the relationship had actually been when it began. I asked him why Mason called him first in emergencies. Ryan went quiet. Then he said something he had not said before. After Daniel died, Mason started reaching for Ryan before almost anyone else. At first it was practical. A broken bike chain. A school pickup. A night when Lauren was sick. Then it became emotional. If Mason was scared, Ryan's name came up. If something went wrong, he called Ryan. I couldn't be another man who disappeared on him, Ryan said. There was no performance in his voice that I could hear. He sounded tired and sincere. For a few seconds, I understood him. A 6-year-old had lost his father. A grieving mother had needed help. Ryan had discovered that showing up could make a frightened child feel safe. The first promise might not have been manipulation at all. It might have been the simplest human instinct in the world. If a child reaches for you, you reach back. That truth did not excuse what came later. But it mattered. I'm not asking why you answered him, I said. Ryan exhaled. I'm asking why answering him became a reason Claire was always supposed to wait. That is not what happened. I thought of the museum, the climbing gym, the missed showcase, the wedding. I did not argue each memory. I was finished trying to win through examples. Ryan said Mason had no father. He said children remember who stays. He said after Daniel died, withdrawing because his own life had gotten easier would have been cruel. He said he could not look at a boy who trusted him and decide that trust had become inconvenient. I listened. Then I heard the missing part. Ryan could explain why he stayed for Mason. He still could not explain why staying for Mason required Claire to lose pieces of him, or why he had needed my invisible consent to make the arrangement legitimate. When the call ended, I stood alone in the kitchen, with my phone in my hand. The answer could not be an affair. It could not be a secret son. There was no hidden blood tie, forcing Ryan into Mason's life. Whatever bound him, there was something he had chosen. And for the first time, that frightened me more. The fact that Ryan had chosen the role should have made the situation easier to understand. Instead, it removed the last excuse I had been giving the mystery. There was no hidden affair forcing secrecy, no biological tie he had been afraid to name, no court order, guardianship paper, or promise written by someone else that required him to build his life around Mason. Ryan had stepped into a frightened boy's life after a tragedy, and somewhere along the way, he had decided the temporary shape of grief should become permanent. I spent most of the next morning doing things that did not require answers. I answered work emails, scheduled Claire's follow-up appointment, and called the caterer because apparently a canceled wedding still generated invoices. Ordinary tasks helped me breathe. Claire sat at the kitchen island working through a summer assignment and occasionally pushed my water glass toward me because she had appointed herself director of hydration. She looked almost normal again. That was a relief I did not trust myself to enjoy fully. Ryan texted just after 10 and asked if we could talk in person. I almost said no. Then I remembered how easily he had used separate conversations to build two versions of reality. If I wanted the truth, I needed him to stop explaining himself in fragments. I told him noon in my backyard while Claire was inside. I also told Lauren I planned to speak with him and asked whether she was willing to answer one question afterward if I needed it. She replied yes, nothing more. Ryan arrived on time. He did not try the front keypad. That small change registered immediately. He walked around the side gate and stopped beside the patio table, where we had once planned to set out lemonade for our wedding guests. The table was bare now, except for 2 unopened boxes of paper napkins. I had not found the energy to return. He sat only after I did. I want to explain this without us fighting, he said. I don't need a better version, I told him. I need the complete one. That ended most of the speech he had probably prepared. I asked him to start with the beginning, not with the wedding. He did. Daniel died in March of 2020. Ryan and I were still separated. Lauren was barely functioning. Mason had stopped trusting normal routines, because normal routines were exactly what had failed him. His father had gone to work one day and never come home. For a 6-year-old, Ryan said, that turned every late pickup into a possibility and every unanswered phone call into a threat. I knew pieces of that already, but I let him continue because I wanted to hear where he placed himself inside the story. At first, he said, he was simply the available person. Daniel's parents lived far enough away that they could not handle everyday emergencies. Lauren's sister had her own family and a job with unpredictable hours. I was managing my own separation and Claire's schedule. Ryan had flexible access to a work truck and enough control over his job site hours that he could leave when something went wrong. So he did. He picked Mason up. He fixed things. He sat through the silence after a bad school day. He answered calls. None of that sounded sinister. That mattered. I could still picture the man I had loved inside those choices. Then Ryan said Mason began expecting him. If Lauren was late, Mason asked whether Ryan was coming. If a bike chain broke, he called Ryan. If he had to fill out a school form asking for another emergency adult, Ryan's name was the one he wanted there. Ryan said the attachment happened gradually enough that he never sat down and decided to become anything. I just kept showing up, he said. For a moment, the sentence reached me. I understood why it had probably reached Lauren too. Grief does not create clean job descriptions. Sometimes a child needs someone before the adults have named what that someone is. Ryan looked at me carefully, as if he saw that understanding and wanted to build on it. He said when we reconciled, he knew he had to balance things differently, but he could not suddenly vanish from Mason's life just because his own relationship had improved. He believed continuity was kinder. He believed a child who had already lost one father figure should not have to interpret another adult stepping back as rejection. That was the strongest defense he had given me so far, because it contained a truth I could not dismiss. For several seconds, I wondered whether I was becoming too rigid, whether I was taking a messy act of loyalty and forcing it through rules that only looked obvious in hindsight. Ryan had helped a grieving child. Mason had attached to him. Ryan stayed. There are worse sins in the world than staying. Then I asked the question that stripped the comfort out of it. Why did you tell Lauren I knew? Ryan's face changed. Not dramatically. He simply stopped leaning forward. That's the part I need you to answer, I said. Not why you helped Mason. Not why you didn't disappear. Why did you tell Lauren I understood and agreed when you had never asked me? He looked toward the yard. Claire's old swing set was still there, even though she had outgrown it years ago. Ryan had built it himself on a hot Saturday when she was 4. I wondered if he was looking at the same memory. Ryan said he had meant to tell me when we were solid again. I reminded him we had reconciled in 2020 and that the permanent code came years later. He rubbed his thumb across his palm. By then, it didn't feel like some new decision. Mason already knew I was his backup. Lauren already relied on me. The house was closer to school. It was practical. You still didn't tell me. I was going to. When? He did not answer immediately. There are lies people tell because they want something in a moment. And there are lies that become easier every year because telling the truth would require admitting how long the lie has been useful. Watching Ryan search for an answer, I understood which kind I was looking at. Finally, he said. Every year it got harder to explain without making it sound bigger than it was. I stared at him. He had just given me the missing timeline in one sentence. At first, there had been no secret. Then there had been an omission. Then the omission became a structure. Each year made the next year easier to hide, because revealing it would mean admitting it had been hidden before. So instead of telling me, I said, you told Lauren I already knew. Ryan's mouth tightened. I told her you understood the situation. You told her I didn't want to discuss details. I thought you wouldn't. You invented my boundary, So you could operate behind it. He flinched at that, but he did not deny it. The quiet that followed was different from our earlier arguments. I was no longer trying to discover whether something happened. Ryan was explaining how he had maintained it. I asked him how far the promise went. He said there had never been anything legal. No guardianship, no custody arrangement, no document giving him parental rights over Mason. That part, at least, matched what Lauren had told me. But the absence of paperwork did not make the emotional promise small. Ryan admitted he had agreed to remain a standing emergency contact. He had told Lauren she could use him for pickups when she was unreachable. He had told Mason he could call him anytime. And yes, he had told Mason that if Lauren was ever seriously ill or unavailable, he would make sure the boy had somewhere safe and familiar to go. "My house," I said. Ryan exhaled. "Our house eventually." The words hit so cleanly I did not respond at first. He meant the house he had never owned, the house he had not yet moved into, the house where Claire and I had lived through our separation while he maintained a condo across town. "It was never our house when you made that promise," I said. "I was going to marry you. That does not move consent backward through time." Ryan looked frustrated. "I knew you. I knew you would never turn Mason away." That was the same argument he had used from the beginning, but now I could hear its real shape. Ryan had not asked because he believed my likely compassion was close enough to permission. I did not want to debate that point again. I had learned something larger. He had not been trapped by a promise to Daniel. He had not been carrying a legal duty. No secret blood tie explained why he treated Mason like a second son. He had built the role one decision at a time, and then hidden those decisions behind what he thought I would probably have agreed to. Later that afternoon, Lauren called me back. I did not repeat everything Ryan had said. I asked her only to confirm the shape of the commitment. She did. Ryan had been an emergency contact for years. He had become the person Mason expected. At school events Lauren could not attend. The code to my house was not the only permanent piece. Lauren said Ryan had repeatedly told Mason that he would always be reachable and that if something serious happened to her, Ryan would make sure Mason did not suddenly lose his school, neighborhood, and familiar adults all at once. Lauren paused before adding the part that made her voice smaller. "I thought that meant your household too." I looked at the front door from where I stood in my kitchen. "Because he told you I agreed." "Yes. Did you ever think he meant he would legally take Mason?" "No. We never had paperwork like that. I knew if something actually happened to me, legal custody would have to be handled properly. It wasn't that. It was emotional certainty. A promise that Ryan would be there while the adults figured out whatever came next." That distinction mattered. Ryan had not secretly arranged to take someone else's child. He had done something both less dramatic and more intimate. He had made himself psychologically permanent. Lauren said she had believed the arrangement was compassionate because she believed all the adults involved knew about it. Now that she understood I had never consented to the house, the code, or the language of us, she could no longer pretend the structure was harmless. "I let him say your name for you," she said quietly. I did not absolve her. "Yes, I know." After the call, I found Claire in the living room sorting through the cards people had left at the wedding. She had separated them into 3 piles. People who mentioned her fainting, people who pretended the wedding had simply been postponed, and people who wrote something awkward enough that she wanted to show me later for entertainment. She looked up when I sat down. "Did you find out?" she asked. I knew exactly what she meant. Some of it. Claire waited. She had become good at waiting. I told her the part that belonged to her. There had been no affair. Ryan was not Mason's biological father. He had chosen to become a permanent backup adult after Daniel died and had kept expanding that role without telling me the full extent. Claire picked at the corner of an envelope. "Like what?" I kept the answer small enough for 12. "School pickups, emergency calls, the code, the promise that Mason would have somewhere familiar to go." if Lauren could not be there. She nodded as if none of those things shocked her individually. Then she said, "That explains some Saturdays." The sentence was so quiet that I almost let it pass. "What Saturdays?" She gave me the kind of look children give adults when they cannot believe we do not remember our own lives. She named 3 occasions over the next 10 minutes. Not a list prepared as evidence, just memories. The science museum she had already told me about. A spring soccer game Ryan left at halftime because Mason was upset after a school argument. A Saturday morning when Claire had wanted help building a display board, and Ryan told her he would come in the afternoon because Mason needed a ride to something. Claire said none of them had seemed important enough to fight over. "Dad always said Mason didn't have what I had," she said. I did not ask her to explain what that meant. I already knew. She had 2 living parents. She had a house. She had me. She was healthy. She was strong. Mason had lost more, so Claire had learned to ask for less. "How many times did you stop asking Dad because you thought Mason needed him more?" I asked. Claire shrugged. That shrug hurt worse than a number. "I don't know." I sat beside her without trying to fix the answer. That was when the door code stopped being the real issue for me. The code was only a physical object. The real arrangement had been built out of time. 1 hour here, 1 canceled plan there. 1 child taught to interpret disappointment as generosity. Ryan came by the next evening to see Claire. She agreed to sit with him on the back patio for 20 minutes. I stayed inside, close enough to be available but not close enough to hear every word. When she came back in, she did not tell me what they discussed. She only said he apologized for the wedding and told her he loved her. "Was that enough?" I asked. Claire frowned at me. "Enough for what?" It was a good question. I did not answer it. Ryan stayed after Claire went upstairs. He wanted to know what Lauren and I had discussed. I told him Lauren confirmed the scope of the arrangement and that I was no longer debating whether it existed. His face hardened slightly. "So now everyone's comparing notes like I committed some crime." "No one said crime. You keep treating it like I did something disgusting." "I'm treating it like you used my consent without having it." Ryan stood with his hands on his hips, the posture he used when a project problem had an obvious solution, and everyone else was making it complicated. "Mason lost his father," he said. "Claire didn't." I had heard versions of that sentence for years. This time there was nowhere for it to hide. He continued before I answered. "Claire had me. Claire had him. Claire had grandparents, teachers, friends, a stable home. Mason had watched his father disappear from his life in a single day. Ryan said the 2 children had never started from the same place, so treating their needs as identical would have been ridiculous. The logic sounded compassionate until I noticed what it permitted. What happens when Mason needs you and Claire needs you at the same time?" I asked. Ryan stared at me. "That depends on what they need." At the wedding, Claire was unconscious. His face tightened. "And Mason had a scrape," I said. "You made the choice in real time." "That is not fair." "It happened." He ran one hand through his hair. "Claire is resilient. She has you." Hearing the phrase again made the pattern impossible to dismiss. It was not a one-time explanation. It was the system Ryan used to justify the hierarchy. Ryan genuinely believed Claire's stability gave him room to spend more of himself somewhere else. Her having me reduced the amount of him she was allowed to need. Her resilience was not simply something he admired. It had become a resource he could draw from. I looked through the kitchen window toward the stairs where Claire had disappeared. "How many times?" I asked. "Have you decided she could absorb the disappointment because Mason had the sadder reason?" Ryan shook his head. "You're framing it like that on purpose. I'm asking because she cannot tell me how many times she stopped asking you." That landed. I saw it. For 1 second, his face lost its certainty. Then he defended the same hierarchy again. Mason had no father. Claire did. Mason needed reassurance that adults did not leave. Claire knew Ryan loved her. Mason's fear was different, more fragile, more urgent. He never said Claire mattered less. He did not need to. I finally understood the mechanism that had allowed him to believe he loved both children equally while giving one of them first claim on his attention. He did not think he was choosing Mason over Claire. He thought he was correcting an unfair world by taking from the child who had more. Except what he had been taking was not his alone to redistribute. It was Claire's time with her father. It was my house. It was my consent. I stood up. Ryan watched me. "What are you doing?" "Setting the part you should have set years ago." I told him I was not asking him to abandon Mason. I was not forbidding him from caring about Mason, seeing Mason, helping Lauren, or being an important adult in that boy's life. Those were choices Ryan could make with Lauren and Mason. But my home was no longer part of that arrangement. My name was no longer permission. Claire's time with her father was no longer something he could quietly sacrifice because another child had a worse history. The code would stay revoked. There would be no standing promise that Mason could come to my house if Lauren was unavailable. And if Ryan wanted to maintain a relationship with Mason, he would have to do it honestly, without using me and Claire as invisible supporting pieces. Ryan looked stunned by how specific the boundary was. "Do you hear yourself?" he asked. "You're separating a child from the only stability he has because you're angry at me." "No. You're taking away his safe place. My house was never yours to give him. He trusts me. Then be trustworthy without lying about me." Ryan's expression closed. I did not keep arguing. For once, I did not need him to agree with the boundary for the boundary to exist. The next day, Lauren called me after she spoke with Ryan. She sounded exhausted but steadier than she had all week. She said she had decided to change Mason's backup plan. Her sister could take more emergencies now. A neighbor Mason had known for years was willing to be an after-school contact. Lauren was going to update the school list and make sure Mason understood that no single adult was carrying the entire plan anymore. "I should have done this sooner," she said. I did not say yes, even though part of me thought it. Then she told me she had said the same thing directly to Ryan. Mason would be safe. Ryan did not have to carry every emergency. She was not asking him to disappear. She was removing the standing expectation that he was the first call for everything. I waited for the obvious response. Relief. If Ryan's deepest concern had truly been that Mason might be stranded, Lauren had just solved it. Mason would have multiple safe adults. No one was asking Ryan to abandon him. The child was protected. But Lauren said Ryan did not sound relieved. He asked why she was doing this now. He asked whether Aaron had pressured her. He said changing the system suddenly would confuse Mason. He wanted to know who the new emergency contacts were and whether they were reliable enough. He argued that no neighbor or relative knew Mason's history the way he did. Lauren stopped talking for a moment. Then she said, "Aaron, I thought telling him Mason would be covered would make him feel better." I looked at the disabled user list on my phone without opening it. "It didn't?" "No." Her answer was quiet. He sounded like I was taking something away from him. That thought followed me into the next morning, when I started undoing the practical life Ryan and I had been preparing to share. None of it felt dramatic. That was almost the strangest part. A wedding can collapse in a single afternoon, but a household has to be dismantled, one ordinary decision at a time. I called the moving company and canceled the truck Ryan had booked for the following Saturday. The deposit was non-refundable. I emailed the furniture store about the dining table we had ordered together and learned that one unopened chair set could be returned, but the custom table could not. I stopped the utility changes that would have added Ryan's name to 2 accounts. I put the unopened bathroom shelves he had bought back into the cardboard box. They came in and moved them to the garage with the other things that were clearly his. I did not keep a running total of what he had cost me. I did not photograph receipts or start building a case for who owed whom. Some money was simply gone, because we had planned a wedding that did not happen. The venue kept part of the deposit under the contract. The florist had already delivered the flowers. The caterer had already cooked food for people who went home early. I could be angry without pretending ordinary business losses were weapons Ryan had used against me. What mattered was simpler. He was not moving in. Our two homes were staying separate. The future we had planned no longer had an address. Claire noticed the boxes in the garage before lunch. She had gone out there looking for a roll of tape and came back, holding one of Ryan's unopened kitchen organizers, like she had discovered evidence of a failed civilization. "So Dad's really not moving in?" she asked. I told her no. She stood very still for a second, then set the organizer on the counter. I waited for anger or relief or some 12-year-old version of either. Instead, she asked whether she should take down the small magnetic calendar she had made for his move-in week. It was stuck to the side of the refrigerator, filled with her jokes about which cabinet he was allowed to ruin first. "You don't have to do anything with it right now," I said. She nodded and left it there. I understood the instinct. Some changes are easier to survive when the evidence stays in place long enough for your brain to catch up. Lauren called that afternoon. Her voice had changed since the first days after the wedding. She still sounded tired, but there was less confusion in it. She had started making practical changes on her side, too. Her sister had agreed to become Mason's first family backup if Lauren could not be reached. A neighbor she had known for years and trusted with a spare key would be the local emergency contact for short gaps after school. The school pickup form would no longer list Ryan as the person to call before everyone else. None of those changes meant Ryan could never see Mason again. They meant Mason's safety no longer depended on Ryan being available. Lauren described it without drama, and that was exactly why the shift mattered. For years, Ryan had talked as if stepping back would leave a hole no one could fill. In less than a week, Lauren had done what responsible parents do all the time. She had built redundancy. More than one adult could help. More than one door could open. Mason was not standing at the edge of abandonment because one man no longer held the center of the plan. "How's he taking it?" I asked. "Mason?" "Yes. He thinks I'm reorganizing things because of the wedding." She paused. "Which is true. I told him adults had made some assumptions that weren't fair to you and we were fixing them. I didn't make it sound like he did anything wrong. That mattered to me more than I expected." "Thank you." He asked if Ryan was mad. "What did you tell him?" "That Ryan is allowed to have feelings and Mason doesn't have to manage them." I closed my eyes for a second. That was a sentence I wished all of us had known 6 years earlier. Ryan texted me before dinner and asked if he could come by for the boxes that were already in my garage. I said yes, because keeping his things would only create another reason for him to remain attached to the house. Claire went upstairs before he arrived. I did not tell her to. She heard his truck in the driveway, looked at me from the stairs, and said she had homework. School was out for summer. Neither of us corrected the lie. Ryan came around through the side gate instead of trying the front keypad. It was the first time I had seen him behave as if he understood that the house was not his to enter anymore. He looked at the stack of boxes near the garage wall and gave a small nod. For a few minutes we worked without speaking. He loaded the bathroom shelves, a lamp, 2 storage bins, and a box of tools he had left after repairing the back steps. The silence made the whole thing feel more final than an argument would have. When only the kitchen organizer remained, he picked it up and stared at it. "Claire chose this one." "I know." He set it back down, instead of putting it in the truck. "Keep it." I almost told him I did not want gifts from a house he would never live in. Then I stopped. The organizer was not the problem. I was tired of treating objects like they carried moral meaning just because the people around them did. I left it on the workbench. Ryan closed the truck bed and leaned against it. "I've been thinking about what you said." I waited. He did not start by defending himself this time. He said he had lied to Lauren about my consent. Not misunderstood. Not assumed. Lied. The word should have felt like progress. In a way, it did. He admitted he had known I had never explicitly agreed to Mason's permanent code or to the promise that my house would function as an emergency home. He said he had kept telling himself he would explain the arrangement properly when things were calmer, then let the years make the explanation harder. I know that was wrong, he said. I did not rescue him from the silence after it. He looked toward the second-floor window, then back at me. But there's something you keep leaving out. The apology had reached its limit. What? Mason was a kid who had already lost his dad. He attached to me. He trusted me. Every time I thought about backing away, I could picture what that would look like to him. Ryan rubbed his thumb against the edge of his truck key. You keep talking about consent, like I sat down and designed some secret family. That's not how it happened. He needed somebody. I became that somebody. Then saying no started to feel cruel. I believed him about the beginning. That was the hardest thing about Ryan. He rarely needed a complete lie when a partial truth could carry him farther. I'm not asking you to rewrite what you did after Daniel died, I said. I'm asking you to stop using the good beginning to justify everything that came after. His face tightened, but he let me continue. You could have helped Mason without promising him my house. You could have stayed in his life without telling Lauren I had agreed to a plan I didn't know existed. You could have cared about him without teaching Claire that her time with you was the easiest thing to give away. I never taught her that. You didn't have to say it in those words. Ryan looked past me toward the house. I know I handled parts of this badly. I'm admitting that. What I'm asking is that you don't make Mason pay for it. I felt the old trap arrive with perfect familiarity. It was almost comforting now that I could recognize it. If I held the boundary, the child suffered. If I relaxed it, Ryan became compassionate again, and I became reasonable again. The only missing detail was that Claire would once more absorb the cost. I am not asking you to abandon Mason, I said. That's what it feels like. To you. He stared at me. Mason can know you. He can care about you. You can go to his games if Lauren wants you there. You can answer a call if his mother is okay with that. What you cannot do is promise my house, use my consent, or take time you already promised Claire and decide she should give it up because Mason has a sadder reason. Ryan shook his head. You make it sound like I was taking from her every time I helped him. No, I'm saying there were times when you did take from her. Those are not the same statement. He pushed away from the truck. Claire has both of us. Mason has already lost a father. By then I no longer needed to unpack the equation. I had heard it often enough to know what it cost Claire, and I was done debating the math with him. Instead, I walked back into the garage and picked up the magnetic calendar Claire had made for his move. I had brought it out after she went upstairs, not because I planned a gesture, but because I was tired of seeing it on the refrigerator. I handed it to Ryan. What's this? The schedule we were going to use when you moved in. He looked down at Claire's handwriting. She had drawn tiny socks beside the date he was supposed to bring the last of his clothes over. You're not moving in, I said. And from now on, if you make plans with Claire, those plans don't get quietly converted into backup time for somebody else. If something truly urgent happens, adults handle it. Claire does not automatically become the flexible part of your calendar. Ryan's jaw tightened. So now you're controlling my time with my daughter? No, I'm refusing to help you take it from her. That distinction mattered. Ryan and I had never had a court-ordered parenting schedule. Our Saturday routines and school pickups had been built by agreement after our separation and had kept working because we trusted each other. I was not declaring that he had no rights as Claire's father. I was saying I would no longer be the adult who praised Claire for surrendering optional time whenever Ryan decided another child needed him more. He put the calendar on the passenger seat of his truck. For a second, he looked older than 40. Not broken, just tired, and suddenly without the easy role he had expected to occupy in two households. I love her, he said. I know you do. His face tightened at the answer, as if it had landed harder than an accusation would have. Love was not the question anymore. After he drove away, I went upstairs and found Claire sitting cross-legged on her bed with a paperback open in front of her. She was not reading. I told her Ryan had taken most of his things. I did not repeat our argument. I did not tell her I had defended her, or expect gratitude for doing something I should have understood years earlier. She asked one practical question. Is Saturday still a thing? Ryan usually had her for most of Saturday under the informal routine we had used for years. I told her I did not know what this weekend would look like yet, but that no one was going to make her responsible for solving it. Her face relaxed slightly. That was enough for the moment. 2 days later, Lauren asked if I could meet her for coffee near my office. I almost said no because we had talked more in 1 week than we had in the previous month, and every conversation seemed to remove another piece of a life I thought I understood. But her message said, I remembered something I need to tell you. So I went. She was already sitting outside when I arrived. There were dark circles under her eyes. She waited until I sat down before saying she had changed the school contacts and told Ryan the new arrangement was in place. Her sister was now the first family call. The neighbor would cover short after-school gaps. Mason knew the plan. Nothing about his daily safety depended on Ryan. How did he react? I asked. Lauren gave a tired laugh without humor, like I fired him from a job he never officially had. She said Ryan had asked whether her sister could really handle emergencies, whether the neighbor was reliable, whether Mason would actually call them if something happened. He had offered to stay listed as a secondary contact, just in case. Lauren had told him no, not because he was dangerous, but because she needed Mason to learn that his support system was bigger than one person. That answer had upset Ryan more than she expected. Then she told me the part she had remembered. The first time she had tried to reduce Ryan's involvement had been when Mason started middle school. She had told Ryan that Mason was older, her business was stable, and she wanted him learning to solve small problems without immediately reaching for an adult rescuer. Ryan had responded that children who lost parents often looked independent before they were ready. Lauren had backed down because the argument sounded protective. The second time had been the following year, after a stretch when Lauren noticed she was calling Ryan less often, and felt proud of herself for it. She mentioned that progress to him. Instead of sounding relieved, Ryan asked whether she was trying to push him out now that the hardest years were over. When she said no, he told her to think about what that would communicate to Mason after all the years Ryan had promised to stay. He said something like, "Don't make him lose another man because you finally feel strong enough to do this alone." Lauren stared into her coffee. At the time I thought he was reminding me to think about Mason. I felt selfish for wanting less help. I thought about the pattern because I had lived my own version of it. Claire felt selfish for wanting more of her father. Lauren felt selfish for needing less of him. Somehow, every direction led back to preserving Ryan's role. "Did you need him then?" I asked. Lauren looked up. "Not the way I had before." "Did Mason?" "Sometimes, but not for everything." She paused. "That's what I'm starting to see. Ryan was helpful. He was genuinely helpful. But there were times when becoming less dependent on him felt like I was doing something wrong to him." The wording stayed with me. Not wrong to Mason, wrong to Ryan. That evening Lauren called again, this time while I was cleaning up after dinner. I heard strain in her voice immediately. "Ryan called Mason," she said. I set the dish towel down. "Did you tell him not to?" "No, not yet. I hadn't set that boundary. I only told Ryan the emergency structure was changing. So this was not a violation of a no-contact rule. Ryan was still a man Mason had known for years, and Lauren had not forbidden him from calling. What mattered was why he had called and what the call did. Lauren said Mason came into her office afterward and asked whether Ryan was going away. She asked why he thought that. Mason told her Ryan had said adults were changing some things, but nothing between the two of them had to change. Ryan had reassured him that no matter what anyone decided about schedules or codes, Mason could still call him. On its face, the message was gentle. It was exactly the kind of thing a caring adult might say to a child during upheaval. But Mason had noticed something Lauren had not expected. He asked me why Ryan sounded scared, she said. I did not answer. Lauren continued. Mason had not sounded frightened when he described the new emergency contacts. He had accepted that his aunt and neighbor could help. He understood that the door code was gone. What unsettled him was Ryan's tone. Mason said Ryan kept repeating that he was not leaving, even though Mason had never asked him not to. For several seconds, neither Lauren nor I spoke. The story Ryan had always told us was that Mason could not bear another loss. Yet now that the practical structure was changing, Mason was adapting. Ryan was the one rushing to secure the bond before anyone had threatened to end it. Lauren exhaled slowly on the other end of the phone. I thought I was the one who couldn't let go of the help. I'm starting to think he's the one who can't let go of being needed. Lauren's sentence stayed with me after we hung up, but I did not repeat it to Claire. I had already learned how dangerous it could be when adults handed children explanations they were not ready to carry. Ryan's need to be needed might eventually explain something important, but it was still an adult conclusion built from adult behavior. Claire did not need a label for her father. She needed room to tell me what living with his choices had felt like. A few days later, we drove to the grocery store because the refrigerator had somehow managed to become empty while I was busy canceling a wedding, returning household items, and answering emails from vendors. Claire pushed the cart while I worked through a list on my phone. It was the most ordinary thing we had done since the conservatory, and I was grateful for the fluorescent lights, the squeak of one bad wheel, the woman comparing cereal prices 3 feet away from us. Ordinary life did not ask me to solve everything at once. Claire had started looking physically like herself again. The bruise on her hip was fading. She still carried a water bottle everywhere, because the fainting had scared her more than she admitted, but she had stopped asking whether she looked pale. She argued with me about buying the expensive strawberries and tried to sneak a box of cookies into the cart while pretending she had no idea how it got there. I let her win both arguments. We were near the frozen foods when she reached for a bag of waffle fries and said, almost casually, "Dad texted me." My hand stopped over a package of chicken. Okay. He asked if I wanted to get lunch this weekend. I waited. I had promised myself I would not turn every mention of Ryan into an interrogation. Claire studied the ingredients on the fries as if they were suddenly fascinating. I didn't answer yet. You don't have to answer right this second. She nodded. Then she said, I used to answer right away. The sentence was quiet enough that I almost missed what was underneath it. What do you mean? Claire put the fries into the cart. If he asked me to do something, I said yes because I didn't know when he'd ask again. I felt the cold air from the freezer case against my arms. Did you think he wouldn't? She shrugged. Not exactly. It was just easier if I didn't ask for stuff first. We moved out of the aisle because another shopper needed the freezer door. I did not speak until we reached the end cap. Why was it easier? Claire rolled the cart forward with one hand. Because if I asked and Mason had something, Dad would say Mason really needed him that day. So if Dad was the one asking me, I knew it was probably safe. Safe. The word did something ugly to my chest. I had spent years thinking Claire was easygoing because she was secure. She was not describing security. She was describing a child who had learned to wait until her father's attention was available before reaching for it. I kept my voice even. How often did that happen? I don't know. She made a face. Not like every week. I'm not asking for a number. That relaxed her a little. She pushed the cart again. Sometimes. Enough that I kind of knew how it worked. What worked? She hesitated. Then she gave me the rule she had built for herself. If Mason's thing sounded sad, I wasn't supposed to compete. There are moments when your child says something simple and you hear years inside it. Claire did not sound angry. That was what made it worse. She sounded as if she were explaining how school lunch worked or why you checked the weather before choosing shoes. The rule had become ordinary to her. I stopped walking. She looked back at me. Mom? I'm okay. It was not true, but this was not the moment to make her manage my face. I took the cart handle from her and moved us toward a quieter aisle. When did you decide that? Claire frowned. I don't know. It just made sense. Because Dad said it? Sometimes. Not exactly like that. She looked uncomfortable, so I let her take her time. If Mason had a bad day, or something with school or his dad came up, Dad would say he needed him. And if I got upset, it felt mean. Because I still had Dad. The logic was painfully clean. Mason's loss had become a permanent measure against which Claire's needs were compared. A canceled afternoon could never be just a canceled afternoon. If she complained, she was complaining against a dead father. I thought about how often I had helped build that logic for her. I had used words like perspective, understanding, gratitude. I had praised her for making space. I had believed I was raising a compassionate child. What I had not noticed was that compassion had become one-directional. Mason's pain always counted. Claire's pain had to pass a moral test first. We finished shopping without turning the grocery store into a therapy session. Claire asked for ice cream. I bought 2 kinds. On the drive home, she changed the subject and complained about a summer reading assignment, and I let her. I had learned that a child could tell you something enormous and still want to discuss a stupid book 10 minutes later. Both things were real. That evening, after groceries were put away, we sat on the back steps with bowls of ice cream melting faster than we could eat them. The air had cooled, and the yard looked almost normal again, now that I had stacked the unused wedding lanterns in the garage. Claire balanced her spoon on the edge of her bowl and watched a moth batter itself against the porch light. I'm sorry, I said. She glanced at me. For what? For teaching you that being good meant asking for less. Her eyebrows pulled together. You didn't say that. No, I didn't use those words. That's not the same thing. No, I said. But I praised you every time you swallowed disappointment because someone else had a harder story. I should have noticed what that was teaching you. Claire scraped her spoon across the bottom of the bowl. Mason did have it harder. Sometimes he did. She looked at me, waiting. That still didn't make your father's promises to you optional. I could feel the old instinct rising in me, the need to explain everything, to make the lesson complete, to offer a polished sentence she could keep. I stopped myself. She did not need a speech. She needed one promise I could actually keep. You never have to prove you're a good person by needing less, I said. Her eyes dropped to the bowl. If you want something from me, ask. If you want something from your dad, you're allowed to ask him too. Someone else having pain does not make your needs selfish. She swallowed. What if I know they need it more? Then you can choose to give something up because you want to. But no adult gets to make that your permanent job. She nodded slowly. I did not ask whether she forgave me. I did not tell her I was doing my best. Both things would have asked her to comfort me. Instead, we sat there until the moth finally gave up on the light and disappeared into the dark. Lauren came by 2 mornings later to return a serving tray I had left at her house weeks before the wedding. She stood on the porch holding it with both hands like the most unnecessary peace offering in Ohio. I found this in a cabinet, she said. I almost laughed. You could have kept it. I thought about it. That was the first easy moment between us since the wedding. I let her in. We drank coffee at the kitchen table while Claire was upstairs. Lauren told me Mason's new emergency plan was working fine. Her sister had agreed to be the first call. A neighbor he had known for years was second. The school had updated the contact order. None of it had created a crisis. No one had been stranded. No child had suddenly become unsafe, because Ryan was no longer the center of the system. Lauren looked at her coffee. I keep thinking about how easy that was. I knew what she meant. For years, Ryan's involvement had felt irreplaceable because everyone had been taught to organize around it. Once Lauren actually replaced the structure, the practical part took a few phone calls. The hard part wasn't the logistics, she said. No. She looked up at me. I should have asked you years ago. It was not the first time she had admitted that, but something in her tone had changed. She was no longer apologizing, only because Ryan had lied. She was naming her own decision not to verify something that involved my house and my life. I believed him because believing him was easier, she said. He was helping. Mason loved him. I was tired, and when he told me you knew, I accepted it because the alternative would have meant I had to ask whether I was taking too much from your family. I appreciated the honesty more than I appreciated the apology. I don't know what happens to us, I said. Lauren nodded. I know. I'm not ready to act like none of this changed anything. I'm not asking you to. That mattered too. We did not hug when she left. We did not declare 20 years of friendship stronger than one betrayal. She took her empty coffee cup to the sink, because that was what she had always done in my house. Then stopped for half a second, as if she was unsure whether she still had the right. I told her to leave it. She did. Trust did not come back because we had one honest morning. But the lies had stopped multiplying between us, and for the moment that was enough. Ryan called that afternoon. I answered because we still shared a daughter. He said Lauren had changed the school contacts too quickly, and that Mason was watching adults dismantle a stable relationship because I was angry about the wedding. I let him finish, then said, Mason is safe. My house was never yours to promise, and Lauren is allowed to build a support system that doesn't depend on you. He said I was punishing a fatherless boy, and that bonds did not disappear because adults had handled consent badly. I agreed the bond was real. That did not give him authority over Lauren's decisions or Claire's time. When he returned again to the fact that Claire had both parents, I said, Claire has both parents only if both parents actually show up for her. He went silent. I did not reopen the list of missed afternoons or the wedding. We ended the call agreeing that future plans involving Claire would be discussed directly and would not be rearranged around Mason without considering Claire separately. The important change was that I no longer argued inside Ryan's moral framework. Over the next week, the world continued to prove that Mason could function without Ryan at the center of every contingency. Lauren handled a client meeting by asking her sister to pick him up. The neighbor drove him home from a summer program one afternoon. Mason went to a friend's house after school. Nothing dramatic happened. Claire and I did ordinary things. We returned one of the lamps Ryan had chosen for the bedroom. We boxed up kitchen items meant for a merged household and divided what belonged to whom. I did not turn any of it into revenge. Some things went back to stores. Some stayed because I had paid for them and liked them. A set of towels did not need to become a symbol. What changed was that I stopped rearranging Claire around Ryan's emergencies with Mason. When Ryan asked whether Claire could shift a planned dinner because he wanted to check in on Mason after a rough day, I said no. Claire did not even know about the request until later. For years, I had made her participate in the sacrifice by asking if she would mind. This time, I did not hand her the moral burden. Ryan took that as exclusion. I took it as parenting. Lauren called one evening sounding tired. She told me Ryan had contacted Mason directly again. She had not forbidden it. At that point, there was no no-contact boundary, and she did not want to create one simply because she was angry. But she had asked Ryan to let the new routines settle and to stop making every change feel like a threat to their relationship. He had called anyway. I did not hear the conversation, and Lauren did not pretend she had heard every word. Mason had told her afterward that Ryan said adults were changing things because Aaron was upset. Ryan had apparently reassured him that he wanted to stay in Mason's life, and that if things felt different, it was not because Ryan had chosen to leave. The wording was careful enough to sound comforting. It also placed an invisible hand around the story. Aaron is angry. Adults are changing things. Ryan does not want to leave. The missing information mattered more than the information he gave. Aaron never consented. Ryan lied about her consent. Lauren was changing the structure because it had been built on that lie. Mason was safe. No one had ordered Ryan to stop caring about him. But Ryan had given Mason a version in which the relationship was being taken away from both of them by outside adults. "Did you tell Mason why the changes were happening?" I asked Lauren. "Not all of it yet," she said. "I told him there were adult decisions that had been made without everyone agreeing and that none of it was his fault. That's enough for now." Lauren was quiet. "He asked whether you hate him." The question hurt because it was so predictable once Ryan's framing was in place. "What did you say?" "That you don't." Good. I wanted to call Mason myself and tell him he had done nothing wrong. I did not. That impulse came from the same place Ryan's had the desire to rush in and fix a child's fear before the parent responsible for him had time to handle it. Lauren was his mother. She was already doing the work. My job was not to take over. Instead, I told Claire only that Mason seemed worried he had caused trouble. She looked genuinely confused. "Why would he think that?" "Because adults have not explained everything perfectly." Claire stared at me. "He just asked about the code." "I know." That didn't make me faint. "I know. And it didn't make Dad say that stuff." "No." She shook her head as if the logic offended her. "That's dumb. 12-year-olds can sometimes reach a clean moral fact faster than adults because they have not yet learned how many layers of explanation to pile on top of it." A day later, Lauren texted me asking if I could call when Claire was occupied. I stepped into the backyard and dialed her. She answered immediately. Her voice sounded different from the week before. Not angry, scared. "What happened?" I asked. She took a breath. "Mason asked me something after dinner." I waited. Lauren said Ryan had spoken to him again that afternoon. Nothing openly cruel. Nothing a stranger would hear, and immediately call manipulation. Ryan had told Mason he loved him, that he was not choosing to leave, and that grown-ups were making decisions because of everything that happened at the wedding. Mason had listened quietly. Then later, when Lauren was loading the dishwasher, he came into the kitchen. Lauren's voice tightened as she repeated the question. "Did Aaron cancel the wedding because I told Claire about the code?" Lauren did not answer Mason's question immediately. I know that because she told me exactly what happened next, and because by then she had become careful about separating what she saw from what she assumed. She said she turned off the kitchen faucet, dried her hands, and asked him to sit at the table. Then, instead of correcting him or telling him what Ryan must have meant, she asked one question. "What did Ryan tell you?" Mason apparently stared at the tabletop for a long time before answering. He said Ryan had told him that he wanted to stay in Mason's life, that adults were changing things because Aaron was upset, and that Aaron might not let Ryan be there in the same way anymore. Mason's last sentence was the one Lauren repeated to me twice because it frightened her. He said none of this is his choice. Lauren called me less than 10 minutes later. Claire was in the living room watching a show with headphones on, so I stepped into my bedroom and closed the door. Lauren did not sound angry anymore. Anger would have been easier. She sounded like a mother who had just realized her child was standing under a weight she had not known anyone had placed there. "He thinks you're taking Ryan away from him," she said. I sat on the edge of my bed. Did Mason say that? No, that's what I'm saying. He didn't use those words. Lauren took a breath and started over, slower. She told me the phrases Mason had actually used. Ryan wants to stay. Aaron may not let him. Adults are changing things. None of this is Ryan's choice. Mason had connected them himself. He did not sound furious at me. He sounded guilty, as if his question at the wedding had set off a chain of events that had trapped Ryan. That distinction mattered. Ryan had not told Mason, "Aaron is evil." He did not need to. He had given a 13-year-old enough pieces to build the same conclusion, while keeping his own hands clean. For years I had watched Ryan do something similar with adults. He rarely ordered anyone to agree with him. He supplied the moral frame. Mason lost his father. Claire has both parents. I promised to stay. You would never want a child stranded. Once the frame was in place, disagreement began to feel like cruelty. Now he had taken that skill into a conversation with the person least equipped to recognize it. I told Lauren not to call Ryan while she was still frightened. I already did, she said. I closed my eyes. She had waited until Mason went upstairs, then called Ryan and asked him why their son. She corrected herself immediately, saying her son believed I controlled whether Ryan was allowed to care about him. I did not hear that conversation. Everything I knew about it came from Lauren afterward, and she was careful not to turn it into theater when she told me. Ryan's answer, according to her, was that Mason deserved honesty. Lauren asked what honesty meant. Ryan said adults were making decisions that affected Mason, and pretending otherwise would be insulting. He insisted he had not blamed me. He had simply told Mason that the wedding changed things, that I was angry, and that Ryan was not choosing to reduce their relationship. Lauren told him that was exactly the problem. He had given Mason enough adult conflict to fear being abandoned, while leaving out the one fact that changed the meaning of everything. I had never agreed to the arrangement in the first place. Ryan apparently became defensive then. He said Lauren was rewriting 6 years of his life because I was angry. He reminded her of hospital nights after Daniel died, school pickups, broken appliances, Father's Day meltdowns, and the first months when Mason would not sleep if Lauren was late getting home. He asked whether all of that had suddenly become manipulation too. Lauren's answer was the first thing she told me that made me put my head down. No, she had said. You were really there for us. That's why this matters. She told Ryan the good things did not disappear because he lied about my consent. If anything, the history made the lie more serious, because everyone had trusted him precisely because so much of his help had been real. He had not needed to invent 6 years of kindness. He had only needed to keep one false assumption alive, that I knew and agreed. Ryan asked whether she expected him to tell Mason, after all these years, that the person he depended on might be removed because adults had made mistakes. Lauren said she expected him not to make Mason responsible for protecting Ryan from those mistakes. When she repeated that part to me, neither of us spoke for a while. I thought about how often Ryan had insisted that stepping back would make Mason lose another man. For years, the sentence had sounded like concern about a child's fear. Now the fear had become useful. As long as Mason believed distance equaled abandonment, Ryan never had to tolerate any version of the relationship that did not place him at the center. What are you going to tell Mason? I asked. The truth, Lauren said. Then, after a pause, the amount of truth he can actually use. That afternoon she did exactly that. I was not there. She called me afterward and told me what she had explained. She said she kept it plain. Aaron had never agreed that her house would be Mason's emergency home. Aaron had never approved the door code. Ryan had told Lauren that Aaron knew, and Lauren had believed him instead of checking. That was an adult mistake. The wedding had not ended because Mason mentioned the code. Claire had fainted because of heat, dehydration, and not eating enough. Ryan's behavior afterward, and the things adults discovered, were what changed the wedding. None of that was Mason's job to repair. Lauren also told him something I wished every child heard before they needed it. You are not responsible for keeping Ryan happy. Mason did not cry, at least not then. According to Lauren, he asked practical questions first. Did I really never know about the code? Had I ever told Ryan it was okay? Had I known he might come to my house if Lauren got sick? Each answer was no. Then Mason asked the question that hurt him most. So it was never my emergency house? Lauren told me she almost answered too quickly. She wanted to say, you were always welcome. She wanted to soften it into something that would preserve the feeling of safety. Instead, she told him the harder, cleaner truth. My home had never been promised by me. If he had ever been in real trouble, of course the adults around him would have helped him. But no one had the right to make a standing promise about my home without asking me. The difference between those statements is obvious to an adult. To Mason, it was the difference between belonging and having been allowed to believe he belonged. When Lauren repeated his next words, her voice broke. Ryan made it sound like Aaron said yes. I stood at my kitchen counter and looked toward the front door. The keypad was still there, unchanged. The same 4-inch square of black plastic that had once seemed like nothing more than convenience had become the object around which 2 children were learning what adults had decided without them. "Yes," I said. Lauren was quiet. "He did." For the first time since the wedding, I felt anger at Ryan that had almost nothing to do with what he had done to me. He had taken a frightened child's need for certainty and attached it to things he did not own. My house, my consent, a future household. Then, when the truth came out, he had positioned himself as the person at risk of being taken away. That evening, Claire asked why I had been on the phone with Lauren so long. I told her only that Mason had finally learned I never agreed to the house code or the emergency home promise. Claire's face changed immediately. "Does he think I knew?" "No." "Does he think I'm mad at him?" "I don't think so." She looked toward her phone on the couch. "Can I text him?" The question made me hesitate. Not because I wanted to control what she said, but because I did not want either child turned into a messenger between adults. I asked what she wanted to tell him. That I don't blame him. That was enough. I checked with Lauren first. She said Mason could use one ordinary conversation with someone his own age. No discussion of Ryan's motives. No asking Mason to report what adults had said. Just 2 kids talking. Claire sent a short message, asking whether he wanted to come over and sit on the front steps for a few minutes. I thought the location was almost painfully appropriate, but I did not say that. Lauren walked him over, because they lived close enough, then continued around the block while the kids sat outside. I stayed inside with the front door cracked and gave them privacy without pretending I was not responsible for the space. Their conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. I did not hear every word, and I did not try to. What I heard clearly was Claire saying, "I don't blame you for the wedding." Mason said something too quiet for me to catch. Claire answered, "No, I fainted because I didn't eat and it was hot. You asking about the code didn't make me fall." Another pause. Then she said, "And Dad said what he said. You didn't make him." There was no dramatic reconciliation because there had never been a real fight between them. That was one of the ugliest things about the whole arrangement. The adults had built a hierarchy around 2 children who, left alone, did not actually want to compete. When Lauren came back, Mason stood quickly. Claire gave him a small wave. He returned it, awkward and 13, and walked away beside his mother. I watched them go through the front window. Claire came inside and headed for the kitchen. "Are you okay?" I asked. She opened the refrigerator. "Yeah." I waited. She pulled out a yogurt. It's weird that he thought it was his house, too. I understood what she meant. Not possessive weird. Sad weird. "Yeah," I said. She closed the refrigerator with her hip. "Dad made both of us think something different." That sentence was closer to the truth than anything I had managed to say. He had taught Claire that she had so much security she should surrender pieces of him. He had taught Mason that his security included pieces of us. And both children had believed him because he was their father, or close enough to one that his words carried the weight of an adult promise. I called Ryan the next morning. I did not ask him to come over. I did not want another patio conversation where the setting could trick either of us into imagining there was still something to repair between us. I took the call in my car during lunch, parked under a tree behind my office. He answered on the first ring. I told him Lauren had explained to Mason that I never consented to the code or the backup home arrangement. Ryan went quiet. Then he said, "She had no business putting adult mistakes on him." The sentence almost stunned me with its precision. "That is what you did," I reassured him. "You told him I might not let you be in his life the same way. I told him things were changing. You told him none of this was your choice." His silence confirmed Lauren's report more effectively than an argument would have. I continued before he could move the conversation back to Mason's grief. "You let him believe I was taking you away while leaving out that you lied about my consent." "That's not what I said. It is what he understood. You can't control what a 13-year-old takes from a conversation. I gripped the steering wheel. For years, Ryan had relied on interpretation when it helped him and disowned it when it hurt him. Lauren believed I had agreed because of what he told her. Mason believed my home was his backup because of what Ryan told him. Claire believed wanting her father could be selfish because of what Ryan told her. Somehow Ryan was always responsible for the comforting meaning and never responsible for the painful one. I did not explain that to him. I was past the point where a perfect argument could save anything. There is no path back to the engagement, I said. Ryan stopped breathing for a beat. We had been living as if that were already true. The wedding was over. His things were out of my house. The ring was gone, but until that moment, I had never said the sentence with no opening attached. No, you're deciding this in the middle of... I decided the wedding was over when I took off the ring. What I am telling you now is that I am not leaving a door open for us to rebuild later. He was silent. I could hear traffic on the road beyond my parking lot. I told him future communication between us would be about Claire. Her schedule, her needs, her school, any formal parenting arrangements we eventually needed to sort out. I was not going to continue serving as the person he argued with about Mason. Ryan said I was cutting 6 years of his life into separate boxes because it made me feel safer. Maybe he was partly right. Boundaries often look like boxes to people who benefited from everything bleeding together. I am separating what is mine to decide from what is not, I said. He asked whether that meant he was not allowed to speak to Mason. That is Lauren's decision as his mother, not mine. He asked whether I wanted him to disappear. No. I had answered that question so many times it no longer carried emotional force. I want you to stop calling every boundary abandonment. Ryan did not respond. I ended the call because there was nothing else I needed from it. Later that day, Lauren told me she had set a new boundary of her own. She had asked Ryan for a period of no direct emotional contact with Mason. Not forever, not punishment. She wanted a few weeks in which Mason could settle into the new support system without being repeatedly reassured that Ryan was not leaving, because every reassurance was keeping the possibility of abandonment alive. Ryan argued, of course. Lauren told me, he said cutting contact suddenly would confuse Mason. She answered that she was not cutting off all future relationship. She was asking Ryan to stop privately managing Mason's feelings about the adults, while those adults were trying to give him one consistent story. Ryan asked whether Mason wanted that. Lauren said Mason wanted the pressure to stop. That should have been enough. It was not. The next evening, Lauren came to my house, without calling first. She had done that 100 times in our friendship, but since the wedding, she had become careful about every boundary, so seeing her on my porch made my stomach tighten. I opened the door. She held out her phone. I told him not to message Mason. I looked at the screen. There was one new text from Ryan to Mason. You know I would never leave you. Nothing else. No threat. No insult. No demand. That was what made it so effective. The sentence transformed a boundary into abandonment again. It told Mason there were two sides, the man who would never leave, and the adults who might force separation. It asked the child to remember loyalty at exactly the moment he had been told he was not responsible for anyone's feelings. Lauren sat at my kitchen table while I read the message a second time. I don't know how to explain this without making Ryan sound worse than he was for years, she said. You don't have to erase the good years. She looked at me. That's the part he keeps using, I said. If the good was real, he thinks the boundary must be wrong. Lauren rubbed both hands over her face. He was there when I couldn't function. I know. Mason loved him. I know. I loved what he did for us. I nodded. None of those truths needed to be destroyed for the present truth to stand. Ryan had been good to them. He had also lied. He had become important to Mason. He was also refusing to let Mason exist outside the role Ryan had built around him. Lauren looked down at her phone. I told Mason he doesn't have to answer. Good. He said he doesn't know what to say. Then he doesn't need to say anything. We sat there for a few minutes. Claire was upstairs. The house was quiet, except for the air conditioner cycling on. I thought about the wedding again, but differently than before. Ryan stepping around Claire had once looked like an impossible choice made in panic. Now I could see the identity beneath it. Mason was not simply the child with the scrape. Mason was the child who confirmed Ryan's role as rescuer, protector, backup father, the man who never left. And the question Mason had asked, seconds before Claire collapsed, had threatened that identity by exposing the part Ryan had built on lies. His reflex had not come from nowhere. It had come from years of needing the role to remain intact. Lauren's phone vibrated in her hand. She looked at the screen, then at me. It's Mason. I did not ask to read it. She opened the message, stared for several seconds, and pressed her lips together. Then she stood. I need to go home. Is he okay? Yes. Her voice shook. I think so. She left before I could ask anything else. An hour later, she called me from her bedroom with the door closed. Mason was downstairs. She said she had gone home and found him at the kitchen table with his phone face down beside him. He had not answered Ryan. Lauren had sat across from him and told him he could miss Ryan, love him, be angry, or want space. None of those feelings made him ungrateful. Mason had asked whether Ryan would be mad if he did not text back. Lauren told him Ryan's feelings were Ryan's responsibility. Then, according to Lauren, Mason stared at the table for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. I don't want a backup dad anymore. Lauren called me the morning after Mason told her. He did not want a backup dad anymore. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the exhaustion under it, the kind that comes after spending several days trying to keep a child from carrying emotions that belong to adults. She had not rushed to call Ryan the moment Mason spoke. She had waited until breakfast, asked Mason whether he still felt the same after sleeping, and then asked what he wanted her to do. Mason did not want another message delivered for him. He wanted Ryan to know he meant it. Lauren told me she had warned him that saying it directly might be uncomfortable. Mason had answered that being uncomfortable was not the same as being wrong. Lauren called Ryan first. I was not there for that conversation, and she did not pretend it had been more dramatic than it was. She told me afterward that she said Mason wanted some distance, and that she intended to honor it. Ryan's response came quickly. Mason was confused. Mason was reacting to adults putting things in his head. Mason was 13 and could not possibly understand what years of consistency meant. Ryan reminded Lauren that he had been there when Mason could not sleep after Daniel died, when school forms asked for a father's name, when a late pickup could send him into panic. Then he asked the question that told Lauren everything she needed to know. He did not ask what Mason had said. He asked who had convinced him. No one, Lauren told him. Ryan apparently did not accept that answer. He said Aaron had been angry from the beginning, that Lauren had changed the emergency system almost overnight, and that Mason was picking up on everyone else's emotions. Lauren told me she kept repeating one simple point. Mason was safe. He had family. He had people to call. He had a home. Nobody was threatening to leave him stranded. He wanted space from one relationship, not protection from abandonment. Ryan kept returning to the same argument anyway. A 13-year-old, who had once lost a father, could not be expected to know whether distance was good for him. When Lauren repeated that sentence to me, I understood why she had called. Ryan still believed the child's stated need mattered less than Ryan's interpretation of it. He thinks Mason is making a mistake, Lauren said. Maybe Mason is, I replied. She went quiet. I continued before she could misunderstand me. People are allowed to make mistakes about their own relationships, especially small ones. Mason can ask for space and later miss him. He can change his mind. That doesn't mean Ryan gets to decide the answer before Mason has had a chance to feel it. Lauren let out a breath. That's what I told him. By then, the question was no longer whether Ryan had once helped Mason. He had. No one was taking that history away. The question was whether helping a child years earlier gave Ryan permanent authority to decide what closeness should look like now. Mason was not 6 anymore. Lauren was not in the first fog of grief. The practical system Ryan claimed to be protecting had already been replaced. His insistence had nowhere left to hide, except inside the relationship itself. Later that afternoon, Lauren called again. This time she said Mason had made one request. He wanted to tell Ryan himself, once, so Ryan could not later say Lauren had misunderstood him. Lauren had agreed to a brief conversation at her house with limits. No surprise visit, no argument that lasted until Mason gave in, no taking Mason somewhere alone afterward to talk it through. Ryan would come, Mason would say what he wanted to say, and Lauren would end the conversation when it stopped being useful. Then Lauren asked if I would be there. My first answer was no. I did not want the moment to become 3 adults standing around a 13-year-old while he performed a moral lesson for us. I did not want Ryan to believe I had assembled an audience. More than anything, I did not want Mason's choice to look like my victory. He had already carried enough guilt about my wedding. I had no intention of becoming the woman Ryan could point to and say, "See? This is who took me away from you." Lauren understood. She said that was not why she was asking. "Ryan's spoken your name for years," she said. "Mason wants him to hear that part too. I don't want Ryan leaving and later telling him you agreed to some other version of what happened." I still hesitated. "Ask Mason," I said. "If he does not want me there, I'm not coming." 10 minutes later, she called back. Mason had said yes, as long as I did not have to say anything. That condition made the decision easier. "I won't," I told her. The conversation happened 2 evenings later in Lauren's living room. I arrived first and sat in a chair near the window, not beside Lauren and not beside Mason. I wanted my body to make the same promise my mouth had made. I was not there to lead anything. Mason sat on the end of the couch with one foot tucked under the other leg. He looked young in a way 13-year-old boys rarely allow themselves to look. No suit, no wedding, no scrape on his arm. Just a kid in a faded t-shirt, rubbing the edge of one thumbnail with the other. Lauren asked him one last time if he wanted me to stay. He nodded. Ryan arrived 5 minutes later. He stopped when he saw me. For a second, his face tightened, and I could almost hear the accusation forming. Lauren stepped in before he could use it. "Erin is here because you used her name in this for years," she said. I asked Mason if he was comfortable with her staying. "He is." Ryan looked at Mason. Mason nodded again. Ryan did not argue. He sat in the chair across from the couch. I had seen him walk into tense rooms before and immediately take control of their temperature. He lowered his voice. He leaned forward. He made himself look open and calm. It was a skill that had once made me feel safe. That evening, it mostly reminded me how often Ryan knew how to become the adult everyone else leaned toward. He started by telling Mason he loved him. Mason stared at his hands. Ryan said he did not want the past few weeks to erase what they had been to each other. He did not call himself Mason's father, which I noticed. He said their bond was bigger than mistakes adults had made around schedules, codes, or communication. He reminded Mason that when Daniel died, Ryan had promised he would not disappear. He had shown up when things were hard. He had taught Mason how to change a bike tire, driven him to school when Lauren was sick, sat through assemblies and bad games, and awkward Father's Day weekends. None of those things were lies. That was what made the moment painful. Ryan was telling the truth. Mason did not need to invent a villain in order to set a boundary. "I know," he said quietly. Ryan's face softened, encouraged. "Then don't let one bad week make you think you have to throw all that away." Mason looked up. "It wasn't 1 week." Ryan sat back slightly. Mason did not launch into a speech. He did not list every time Ryan had helped him, or every lie he had learned about afterward. He said the part that mattered to him. He had believed my house was somewhere he was allowed to go. He had believed I knew. He had believed Claire knew. He had stood at my wedding and asked about the code because he thought the only thing changing was where Ryan slept after the ceremony. Ryan opened his mouth, but Mason kept going. When I asked, everybody looked weird. Then Claire fell. Then you told me none of this was your choice. Ryan's eyes flicked toward Lauren, then back to Mason. I was trying to make sure you understood I wasn't abandoning you. I didn't ask if you were. The room went still. Mason rubbed his thumb against his knee. That's what I mean. You keep telling me I'm scared you're going to leave. I'm not. Ryan's face changed in a way I had seen several times since the wedding. Not anger exactly. Disorientation. The story he knew how to answer had been taken away from him. He tried another approach. He told Mason that grief could make people think they were fine before they actually were. He said 13 felt older than it was. He said Mason might not realize how much their routine had helped him because it had become normal. None of those statements were ridiculous. Children do sometimes push away people they later miss. Trauma does outlast the obvious crisis. Ryan could still build a reasonable argument from true pieces, but every sentence had the same center. Ryan knew what Mason needed better than Mason did. Mason listened until Ryan stopped. Then he said, I'm not saying you never helped me. Ryan's shoulders loosened slightly. I'm saying I don't want to be the reason you lie to Aaron or Claire. Ryan looked toward me. I kept my promise and said nothing. Mason continued. And I don't want you calling yourself my backup dad anymore. Ryan's face went blank. Mason swallowed. You're Ryan. You were my dad's friend. You helped us. That can be true. But I don't want you deciding I need you like that. For the first time, the person Ryan had spent years claiming to protect had given him the cleanest possible exit. Mason did not call him fake. He did not deny the good years. He did not demand that Ryan vanish forever. He simply removed the title Ryan had built his identity around. Ryan could have accepted it. He could have said, I hear you. He could have said, I'm sorry I made you carry this. He could have allowed the relationship to become smaller without making smaller mean worthless. Instead, he leaned forward again. You're going to understand this differently when you're older. Mason's face closed. Lauren's did too. Ryan kept going. He said teenagers often wanted distance from adults who had been important to them. He said he would respect that Mason was upset, but he would not pretend years of family could be erased, because everyone had handled one terrible week badly. Then he looked at Lauren. Don't do that to him. Lauren's jaw tightened. Do what? Erase me because Aaron is angry. I watched Mason's shoulders rise toward his ears. Lauren saw it too. This is over, she said. Ryan looked at her. I'm talking to Mason. No, you're explaining Mason to Mason. The sentence landed without volume. Ryan looked back at the boy. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. Mason's answer came faster this time. I already did. Ryan stared at him. No one moved for several seconds. I had imagined that truth would feel like discovery. A code, a confession, a fact large enough to make everything snap into place. The deepest truth turned out to be much quieter. Mason was safe. Lauren no longer depended on Ryan. I was no longer available as invisible consent. There was nothing left for Ryan to rescue, and he still could not step back. The wedding suddenly made sense. In a way it had. Not even after I learned about the code. Ryan had not only gone to Mason, because Mason was bleeding. He had gone to the role, to the child whose need had become proof of who Ryan believed himself to be. Claire, lying motionless on the floor, should have broken every hierarchy. Instead, Ryan had instinctively protected the structure in which Mason needed him and Claire could wait. Lauren stood. That ended the conversation. Ryan looked at her as if she had violated some rule of fairness. You're really going to do this? I'm going to listen to my son. Ryan looked at Mason one last time. You can call me. Mason did not answer. Lauren walked Ryan to the door. I stayed in my chair. Mason stayed on the couch. I did not go to him, hug him, tell him he had been brave, or turn his boundary into an achievement adults could praise. He had not performed courage for us. He had asked to be left out of a role he no longer wanted. When Lauren came back, Mason stood. "I'm going upstairs," he said. She nodded. As he passed me, he paused for half a second. "Thanks for not talking." It was the most appropriate thing anyone could have thanked me for. I drove home thinking about how often I had believed love required intervention. Explain, smooth, translate, make everyone understand each other before anyone was allowed to leave the room. That night, for once, the most loving thing had been allowing a child's no to remain a complete sentence. Claire was at the kitchen table when I got home, drawing tiny stars in the margin of a summer worksheet instead of doing the actual work. She looked up at me and asked how Lauren was. I told her everyone was tired and left it there. Mason's conversation was his. I did not make him a story Claire had to process. 2 days later, Ryan texted Claire asking whether she wanted to do their usual Saturday together. She showed me the message without commentary. For years, Saturday had existed by habit. There was no court order behind it. After our separation, Ryan and I had built a routine that worked well enough that we never formalized it. Most Saturdays he picked Claire up in the morning, took her somewhere for lunch or errands or whatever plan they had made, then brought her home by evening. Sometimes schedules changed. Sometimes she stayed longer. It had been one of the things I once used as evidence that Ryan was a good father. Claire read the text again. "What do I have to say?" The wording mattered. "Nothing right this second." She looked at me. "No, I mean, am I supposed to go?" I sat across from her. I told her Ryan was her father, and that the adults would have to work out the formal parts of parenting now that our relationship had ended. I was not going to pretend those responsibilities disappeared because a wedding did. But the specific Saturday invitation in front of her was still an invitation. If she was not emotionally ready for an optional day that looked exactly like the old routine, she was allowed to say that. Claire stared at the phone for a long time. Then she typed, deleted, typed again, and finally asked if I would stay nearby while she called him instead. She did not want me to speak. That request felt familiar. Ryan answered quickly. I sat at the other end of the kitchen table, while Claire told him she had seen his message. She said she was not ready to do Saturday like before. Ryan asked whether that meant this Saturday or all Saturdays. Claire's fingers tightened around the phone. I don't know, she said. I'll tell you when I'm ready. Ryan was quiet. Then he asked if I had told her to say that. Claire looked at me. I did not react. No, she said. He asked whether she was angry with him. Claire said yes, but she also said she did not want to talk about all of it on the phone. She sounded 12, not polished, not certain. She repeated that she was not ready. Ryan tried once more. He said routine might help. He said spending time together could be easier than waiting until everything felt perfect. Claire listened. Then she said, Dad. I said I'm not ready. Something in me tightened and released at the same time. Ryan stopped. All right, he said finally. It was not a warm ending. It was not reconciliation. It was also not rejection forever. It was a boundary. When the call ended, Claire put the phone face down. I did not tell her she had done the right thing. I did not tell her she had been strong. That word had carried enough weight in our house. I asked if she wanted dinner. She said yes. That evening, Ryan called me instead. He was controlled, but the hurt in his voice was obvious. He said Claire was 12, and that we could not let a child dictate the entire shape of their relationship. I agreed with the first half. Claire did not control legal parenthood. She did not decide what responsibilities adults had. Ryan and I would need to handle the formal parenting arrangement properly, instead of relying forever on the informal routine we had built years ago. But I would not negotiate away what Claire had actually said. "She told you she isn't ready for Saturday," I said. Ryan exhaled. "So that's it?" "For this Saturday, yes. You're just letting her decide?" "I'm letting her answer whether she wants an optional outing right now. The adult part is ours to handle." He was quiet. In the past, I would have filled that silence. I would have reminded him Claire loved him. I would have offered another day. I would have softened the boundary until he could leave the conversation feeling useful. I did none of those things. Ryan said he wanted to repair things with his daughter. I believed him. Wanting repair, however, was not the same as controlling its speed. By the time the call ended, Ryan still had his job, his condo, his health, his future, and he was still Claire's father. The consequences were relational, not public, but the roles he had treated as permanent were no longer his to schedule. The ring was gone. The move into my house was gone. His code was gone. Mason had rejected the backup father role. Claire had refused the automatic return of the Saturday routine. Ryan had spent years deciding which child needed him most. Now, for the first time, neither child was asking him to make that decision for them, and he had no idea what to do with a life in which no one needed him to decide what came next. For the first few days after Claire told Ryan she was not ready to return to their old Saturday routine, nothing dramatic happened, which turned out to be exactly what we needed. There were no more revelations waiting in door codes, no last-minute confession, no person arriving with proof that would simplify everything. There was laundry, grocery lists, work, a stack of wedding cards I finally moved from the dining table into a drawer because Claire was tired of seeing strangers wish us a happy marriage that had never happened. The venue kept the portion of the deposit the contract allowed it to keep. The florist had already been paid. The caterer refunded what had not been used and kept what had. Ryan and I divided the household purchases we could still return and accepted the losses we could not. He took the custom dining table because I did not want to look at it every morning and turn furniture into a punishment. I kept the towels because they were good towels. That was how the first part of our ending went. Not as revenge, but as paperwork and cardboard boxes. Ryan never moved into my house. His dresser drawer stayed empty until I filled it with winter clothes. The space in the garage where his boxes had waited became space for Claire's bike again. For a while, those small physical changes hurt more than I expected. I had spent years believing caution had made our second chance safer. Separate homes, slow rebuilding, a wedding only after we were sure. I had thought patience protected us from repeating the mistakes of our first breakup. What I had not understood was that patience could only protect a relationship if both people were living in the same reality. Ryan had let me rebuild trust around a version of his life that left out the commitments he had made in my name. No amount of moving slowly could make that honest. The harder practical issue was Claire. Ryan was still her father. He had acknowledged paternity when she was born, and our years of co-parenting had never depended on a court order because, until the wedding, we had been able to make an informal routine work. After everything that happened, I did not pretend one terrible decision at a wedding gave me the right to erase him from her life. It also did not mean we could simply return to the old Saturday pattern, as if trust were a calendar entry. We each got family law guidance, then used mediation to put an interim arrangement in writing while we figured out what longer-term parenting would look like. The process was far less dramatic than television makes those things seem. There was no judge deciding which of us was the better person. We agreed that communication about Claire would stay between adults, that plans would be predictable, and that her age and comfort would be taken seriously without making her responsible for the legal structure around her. I was careful about that distinction with Claire, because I had already watched adults make children carry things that belonged to adults. I told her she was allowed to say, when she felt ready for optional time with her father, allowed to tell us when something made her uncomfortable, and allowed to ask for space. She was not responsible for deciding whether Ryan had parental rights or for solving our schedule. Those were adult responsibilities. At first she seemed almost annoyed by how often I repeated that. Then one evening she said, So I can say I don't want lunch this weekend without it meaning I never want lunch again? I told her yes. Her whole face changed. It was such a small freedom. But for a child who had learned that one request could become evidence of selfishness, small freedoms mattered. Her medical follow-up was reassuring too. She did not faint again. Her pediatrician reviewed the emergency room evaluation, asked about the days since the collapse, and repeated the boring advice that had become almost sacred in our house. Eat, drink water. Do not ignore dizziness, take heat seriously. Claire turned hydration into a running joke and started carrying a bottle covered in stickers she insisted made it medically superior. The wedding collapse did not become a chronic illness or a mystery waiting to return. Physically, she recovered. Emotionally, the change showed up in smaller ways. She began asking for things, before deciding whether she was allowed to want them. The first time I noticed, she was standing in the kitchen on a Thursday afternoon while I was answering work email. She wanted to go to a friend's birthday dinner Saturday evening. In the past, she would have begun by explaining why it would not inconvenience anyone, who else was going, how she could get a ride, and why it was fine if the answer was no. This time she simply asked, "Can I go?" When I looked up, she was waiting for an answer, instead of preparing to withdraw the request. I checked the time, asked one practical question, and said yes. She smiled and went upstairs. The whole exchange took less than a minute. I sat there afterward with my hands resting on the keyboard, thinking about how often I had mistaken a child's careful self-erasure for maturity. Ryan apologized more than once during those months. The first apologies still had too much explanation attached to them. He would say he was sorry, then add that he had never meant to hurt Claire, never meant to deceive me for years, never believed Mason's needs would become a threat to our family. Later, the explanations got shorter. Once, after a mediation session, we stood beside our cars in a parking lot while late summer heat lifted from the pavement. He said he was sorry he had trained himself to hear Claire's strength as permission. He did not ask me to forgive him. He did not mention Daniel. He did not say Mason needed him. For the first time, the apology ended before becoming a defense. I believed he meant it. Believing that did not make me want him back. That was another thing I had to learn. An apology can be sincere and still arrive after the relationship it might have saved. Ryan's remorse did not rebuild the wedding, restore the years Claire had spent making herself easy, or erase the moment he stepped around her, while she lay unconscious. I did not need to call him evil, to know I would not marry him. He was still capable of helping people. He still worked, paid his bills, showed up to the meetings we had agreed to attend, and sometimes made Claire laugh when they spoke. The consequence was not that his life ended. The consequence was that certain roles no longer belonged to him simply because he wanted them. Claire did not move toward him in a straight line. Some weeks she answered his texts quickly. Other weeks she left them unread for hours. She agreed to one short breakfast with him after telling me she wanted somewhere public and wanted to know exactly when she would be home. I did not turn the meal into a test. When she returned, I asked if she had a good time. She said, "It was okay," then asked whether we had any cereal left. I let okay be enough. A month later, she declined another invitation because she did not feel like talking to him. Ryan did not like that, but by then he had started learning that disappointment was not the same as abandonment. At least, he was learning to sit with it, instead of immediately trying to change her answer. There was one evening when Claire brought her phone into the living room and showed me a message from him. Ryan had written that he hoped school was going well, and that he was proud of the science grade she had mentioned in their last call. No guilt. No reference to how much he missed her. No reminder that he was still her father. Claire read it twice, then typed back, "Thanks." I watched her hit send and felt a strange mix of sadness and hope. It was not reconciliation. It was not forgiveness. It was one ordinary exchange that did not ask her to comfort him. For now, that was the only kind of progress I trusted. Lauren and Mason had their own slower adjustment. I knew only what Lauren chose to tell me, and I stopped asking for details that did not belong to me. Ryan was no longer Mason's standing emergency contact. Lauren's sister and the trusted neighbor handled the practical backup plan. Mason had no promised place in my house and no permanent code. He remained safe. He went to school, saw friends, complained about homework, and learned that an emergency plan could be boring instead of emotionally loaded. Lauren told me he sometimes missed Ryan. Of course he did. Ryan had been part of his childhood. There were good memories mixed into the bad structure, and neither Lauren nor I tried to make him hate those memories just because the adults now understood the arrangement differently. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after the conversation at Lauren's house, she told me Mason had found an old photograph of himself and Ryan repairing a bicycle. He kept it on his desk. Lauren had asked whether he wanted to put it away. Mason said no. He also said he still did not want Ryan to be his backup dad. Those two facts existed together. I was glad Lauren let them. Children should not have to erase affection in order to prove a boundary is real. Missing someone does not give that person permission to resume a role you no longer want. My friendship with Lauren worked much the same way. We did not snap back into the women who used to call each other from grocery store aisles over nothing. For a while, our conversations stayed practical and brief. We checked on the children. We coordinated one school event. She sent me a picture of a ridiculous cake Mason tried to bake, and I responded with a laughing face because anything more intimate still felt difficult. Then, slowly, ordinary things came back. Coffee once. A phone call about a client problem she knew I would understand. A Saturday when she helped me carry a heavy planter from the car because she happened to be nearby. None of it erased the fact that she had accepted Ryan's version of my consent because verifying it would have been uncomfortable. None of it erased the fact that Ryan had deceived her too. The difference now was that we stopped using discomfort as a reason not to ask. At one of those coffees, Lauren said she had spent years thinking trust meant believing someone who had earned it. Now she thought trust also meant being willing to check when another person's rights were involved. I told her I had spent years thinking love meant giving people the most generous interpretation possible. We both laughed, not because either lesson was funny, but because we had managed to build two different mistakes around the same fear of being unkind. We did not promise never to fail each other again. We promised something smaller and more useful. If one of us was speaking for the other person would actually be in the conversation. By late August, the house no longer looked like a wedding had failed inside it. The last unopened box from Ryan's planned move was gone. I donated the paper lanterns. Claire finally removed the magnetic calendar from the refrigerator and used the back of it to test paint colors for a school project. The pale mark where my ring had been disappeared from my finger long before I stopped noticing it. The front door keypad, however, stayed exactly where it had always been. One Sunday afternoon, I opened the Smart Lock app and realized I had never cleaned up the user list beyond revoking Ryan and the guest codes he had created. There were old temporary entries from contractors, a cousin who had visited the previous Christmas, and one code for a dog sitter we had not used in a year. Nothing dangerous. Just clutter from a life where I had treated access as a convenience instead of a decision. I sat at the kitchen table with my phone and began deleting what no longer belonged there. Claire came in halfway through and looked over my shoulder. "Are you finally getting rid of the code named Plumber that's been there since I was 10? I looked at her. "How do you know about that?" "You showed me once because you thought Plumber was a funny password." I was apparently very advanced in security. She laughed and pulled out the chair beside me. For a moment, I considered finishing the list myself. It was my house. Legally and practically, the decisions were mine. Then I remembered Mason at the wedding, asking whether his code still worked because an adult had turned access into a promise without including the people who lived behind the door. I set the phone between us. "Who do you think should have emergency access?" I asked. Claire looked surprised. "Like a code?" "Maybe. Or maybe nobody gets a standing one right now. I'm asking what would make you feel comfortable." She stared at the screen. I watched the old version of myself almost step in with sensible answers. We should have redundancy. Someone nearby should have access. Lauren's house was close enough. Ryan was still her father. There were plenty of reasonable arguments I could have supplied before Claire formed her own thought. I kept quiet. After a while, she said, "Can it just be us for now?" "Yes. And if we decide somebody else needs one, we talk first?" "Yes." She nodded. Then that. It was not the most efficient emergency system in the world. We could add someone later. We could make temporary codes when needed. The point was not that a 12-year-old had gained veto power over every practical decision in my house. The point was that she lived there, and I wanted her to learn what I had failed to teach by example. People affected by a promise should know the promise exists. I cleared the remaining old guest codes and left only our own access. Then I changed the notification settings so future user creation would show up on my phone. Claire watched me do it and said, "That seems like something you should have turned on years ago." "Thank you, security consultant. My rates are high." "How high?" "Strawberries." I laughed harder than the joke deserved, and she grinned. That sound, more than any apology or formal agreement, made the house feel like ours again. The word strong changed too. I stopped using it when Claire swallowed something that hurt. I used it when she asked a difficult question, when she told Ryan she was not ready, when she changed her mind without apologizing for changing it, when she admitted she missed him after spending 3 days insisting she did not. Strength was no longer how little she required from other people. Sometimes it was simply the ability to say, "I want this," or "I don't want this yet," and trust that love would survive the sentence. Ryan's life continued. He still had his condo, his job, his friends, and a future that was not mine to design. When we met for parenting matters, he looked less like the man who had arrived trembling at my locked door and more like someone learning that losing a role did not mean being erased as a person. I did not know whether he would ever fully understand what he had done, and I no longer needed that answer. What I did know was what he had lost: the wedding, the move into my home, Mason's backup, father role, and the right to set Claire's timetable for forgiveness. Those losses were not punishments engineered for him. They were the relationships other people stopped letting him define. 2.5 months after the wedding, Claire and I came home one evening with takeout balanced between us, because neither of us wanted to cook. She reached the porch first and stopped at the keypad. For a second, I saw the conservatory again. Mason asking about a code, Claire asking what code, Ryan saying not now. The memory still hurt. I had stopped expecting pain to disappear just because I understood it. Claire entered her number and opened the door. Before going inside, she looked back at me. "Mom? What?" "Next Saturday, I think I might want breakfast with Dad again." I kept my face still, even though something moved through me. "Okay, just breakfast." "Then just breakfast." She nodded, satisfied. No promise beyond what she had asked for. No demand that one meal become forgiveness. No adult deciding what her readiness meant before she had finished feeling it. She stepped inside, and I followed with the takeout. I could not go back and return every Saturday Claire had surrendered. I could not make Ryan choose differently at the altar. I could not turn Lauren's assumptions into questions before years had passed, or remove the guilt Mason carried when he learned a home had been promised to him by someone who did not own it. I could only refuse to keep calling those old sacrifices maturity. The door closed behind us with only the access we had chosen together. And for the first time, I understood that protecting a family did not mean making everyone stay. It meant making sure no one had to disappear inside it.